Preface of Sketch of the Great Fires in Wisconsin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Verla Viera. Sketch of the Great Fires in Wisconsin at Peshtigo, the Sugar Bush, Menaconi, Williamsonville, and generally on the shores of Green Bay, with thrilling and truthful incidents by eyewitnesses. Also, a statement of relief funds contributed. By Frank Tilton. Preface. In presenting this work to the public, we are aware that we are again opening to general notice the harrowing details of a calamity that has already impressed the minds of this nation with horror, while it has aroused the generous impulses of noble hearts throughout the length and breadth of this land. And not only that, but it has stirred up the hearts of the dwellers beyond the seas, and proved all civilized nations kindred in times of suffering. The design of this book is to present in brief space and convenient form for preservation the prominent facts in regard to the terrible and unparalleled conflagrations that desolated the northeastern counties of Wisconsin on the night of October 8, 1871, and in a few short hours swept from time into eternity more than 1,000 men, women, and children, rendered about 4,000 people homeless and utterly destitute, and afflicted hundreds of others with wounds to which the pangs of death were almost preferable. We also present in this work numerous instances of heroism, love, and devotion, worthy to be recorded for the emulation of the people of the world for all time to come. We make no pretensions to an artistic work, but aim to give a plain, unvarnished tale. It is no fancy sketch. We have not drawn upon fiction, but rely upon fact as still more marvelous. Hoping that the public will accept this book with favor, and assuring our readers that the proceeds will be worthily bestowed and will furnish bread for some of the sufferers, we subscribe ourselves, the author. End of preface. Chapters 1 and 2 of Sketch of the Great Fires in Wisconsin, by Frank Tilton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Verla Viera. Chapter 1. The northeastern portion of the state of Wisconsin, comprising the counties of Brown, Oconto, Dorr, Kewaunee, and Shawano, had begun within but a few years past to be reclaimed from a primeval wilderness. It is within the memory of many of the present dwellers here, who have not yet passed middle age, when nearly the whole region embraced in these present counties was an unbroken wilderness of timber, with no highways, unless a blazed road or trail could be called a highway. No population but the original dusky sons of the forest, or the hardy pioneer trapper or trader, or the pious missionary. While early in the history of the territory, a military post was formed at Green Bay, and a few pioneers gathered about it. Before the settlement of the southern portion of the territory now embraced in the state of Wisconsin, when immigration began to flock hither, the prairie regions offered the readiest inducements to the husbandman, and the timbered region remained comparatively a wilderness. But this northeastern portion of Wisconsin held an immense resource of wealth in the very timber that delayed its settlement. It was covered with vast tracts of pine as well as oak, beech, maple, cedar, and other valuable woods, which were held in store by nature for use in the development of other sections as well as this. The rapid growth of the Northwest has created an immense demand for these products of the forest, and mills and thriving settlements have sprung up as if by magic, rapidly converting the pine into lumber and shingles, the cedar into fence posts and telegraph poles, the oak into staves, and utilizing all the woods, making them, instead of a curse, the source of our wealth. Green Bay, a magnificent sheet of water running northwardly nearly parallel with Lake Michigan, and separated from the lake by a long, narrow peninsula of land comprising the county of Dorr and parts of Kewaunee and Brown, floats an immense fleet of vessels which carry the products of the adjacent country to market. This peninsula varies from about 30 miles in width at its base to 3 or 4 miles at its northern end. Green Bay is from 5 to 30 miles in width, and 100 miles long to its first outlet into Lake Michigan. On the peninsula or eastern shore of the bay are several thriving settlements, such as Dixville in Kewaunee County, and Big Sturgeon Bay and Little Sturgeon Bay in Door County, the nucleus of these settlements being sawmills, and agricultural communities were gradually settling up the interior. On the west shore of Green Bay, numerous rivers and small streams empty into the bay, and at or near the mouth of each are large sawmills and other manufacturing establishments. These rivers are the Big Swamico, Little Swamico, Oconto, Pensacola, Peshtigo, and Menominee, and in Michigan, the Little Cedar, Bark River, Birch Creek, Ford River, and Escanaba River. The timber cut on the upper waters of these streams is floated down to the mills and there manufactured for shipment. Some of these mills are immense institutions and give employment to large numbers of men. The general character of the soil along the west shore of the bay is sandy and sterile for from 1 to 4 miles back from the bay, and is thickly timbered with evergreens, but there are now and then considerable tracts of good sandy loam, upon which are heavy growths of beech, maple, oak, and other timber, and the land is excellent for agricultural purposes. There are also numerous tracts of marsh, some of them timbered with cedar and tamarack, and some bare and yielding large quantities of native cranberries. Back from the bay shore, however, the character of the soil is better, and there is a fine agricultural country, which is becoming rapidly settled up with a thriving and industrious population. Among the most thrifty of these fanning settlements were those in the vicinity of Peshtigo village, and known as the Sugar Bushes. The lower Sugar Bush comprises the settlements extending westwardly from Peshtigo village for about 7 miles, on the road running southeastwardly to Oconto, and a branch striking westwardly from that near the village. The upper Sugar Bush settlement lay along the road running southwesterly from Peshtigo, and known as the Lake Naquabe Road. Between these two settlements was a road running southwesterly, and the settlements upon it were called the Middle Sugar Bush. These settlements consisted of about 300 families. We have been thus particular in describing the country that the scene of the fires may be better appreciated. The eastern shore of the bay differed from the western more in the fact that it contained fewer villages, the population being scattered upon farms. The land is generally good, and the timber being heavy, the clearings have been accomplished at great expense of muscle and time by the hardy settlers. Most of them are of foreign birth, Belgians, French, Danes, Bohemians, etc., who were beginning, after years of patient, hard toil, to gather together some of the comforts of life, in addition to the bare necessities which in their poverty they had been content with as pioneers. Their lives had indeed been lives of patient toil. The first of these Belgian colonists arrived here in 1855, 56, and 57, and were absorbed into the almost unbroken woods, and for a time lost sight of by the dwellers in the cities and villages. But after they had erected their rude cabins, they were soon heard from. Their daughters applied for and received employment as servants, earning their own support and learning our language, while fathers, brothers, and mothers were at work with a will, taming the forests. They cut down the timber, cut it into bolts, split out and shaved shingles by hand, and brought them into the streets of Green Bay on rude carts by ox teams and even with cows, in some instances employing 2 or 3 days with one trip, and living on the milk of the cows on the way. Such industry and patient endurance always meets with reward, and their case was not an exception. Their ox teams were superseded by horses. They are now supplied with good houses and with agricultural implements, and the products of their farms is an important item in the general product of this region. Chapter 2. The summer of 1871 will ever be a memorable one in northern Wisconsin, as indeed in many other localities. It will be memorable throughout the United States for its shipwrecks, for the losses by fire in every quarter, for the crimes and the accidents that have cast shadows over nearly every day. But especially have northern Wisconsin and Michigan to remember it, for the unparalleled drought throughout those states and the consequent devastating fires that have left black, unsightly scars upon their fair domain. Northern Wisconsin, as a rule, is not subject to drought. While in former years the earth in the central and southern portions of the state has been parched and vegetation blighted and withered, the gentle showers of heaven have not failed to descend here, and the harvest time has witnessed the gathering in of abundant crops of grain, hay, and all the products of the soil. We had come to consider droughts very much in the light of penalties imposed by nature for the cutting down of the forests, and considered ourselves, with our vast extent of timberland, comparatively secure. We had needed no prophet to pray for rain, for when the farmer began to look at his wilting crops and to think the rain was needed, it usually came. But the season of 1871 was an exception. The winter preceding was comparatively without snow, and this was the first calamity to the northern lumbermen, as they were unable to secure their usual stock of logs. An extremely wet spring was prophesied, but the prophecy was not fulfilled. There was no unusual amount of rain. The months of April and May passed with their usual smiles and tears, and June and July failed to bring a compensating amount of rain. On the night of the 8th of July there was quite a smart shower, but the thirsty land drank up the moisture, and it left little trace. The swamps, which, as we have before remarked, are frequent in this portion of the state, are usually covered with from 1 to 2 feet of water, but so dry had they become that no water was visible, and one could readily walk over the surface. The want of water began to be keenly felt. The northern extension of the C and N.W. Railroad from Fort Howard to Menominee was being built, and in the location of railroad camps the most difficult thing was to find a site where water was plenty. Deep wells were unsuccessfully dug, and in some cases wells were sunk to the depth of 10 feet in the midst of the usually impassable swamps before water was found, and then the supply was meager and unsatisfactory. Many of the railroad hands laid down their implements and refused to work, owing to the insufficiency and poor quality of the water, and we saw water carried several miles out on the line of the road from Peshtigo to supply the hands. The railroad embankments in the sand were like hot ash heaps, into which the feet would sink at every step, and the swamps, that had been considered the greatest obstacle to the cheap construction of the road, proved the best working ground. Again, on the night of the 5th of September, another grateful shower fell, which, had it not been for the parched condition of the ground, would have been considered quite a heavy rain. But in a few hours after the shower no trace of it remained, and the ground was as dry as before. Who can account for the origin of fires in the woods? And could we trace the origin of the fires here, of what avail would it be? Certain it is that in all long-continued droughts the timberlands are liable to fire, even, we believe, in the native forests untrodden by man. It would be easy to conceive that the line of fire northwardly from Green Bay and Fort Howard to Menominee was occasioned by the burning up of the debris of the woods on the railroad workings, but the fact is that it was confined to no such line, but sprang up on both sides of the bay, in places remote from each other, and in fact extended southwardly nearly or quite to Fond du Lac, a distance of 150 miles south of its northern limit. Be it as it may, fires got into the timber not far from the 10th of September, and smoldered along the ground through the vegetable mold and dry leaves and underbrush, attacking and gnawing the roots of the sturdy forest trees that had withstood the tempests of ages, as a cancer eats away the life of a man. Then, when some storm of wind swept through the forest, the giant trees, deprived of their smaller root, would topple over, and their trunks would be wrapped in a winding sheet of fire. Again the fires would reach a clump of cedars or tamaracks. The flames would dance around their roots, reaching up forked tongues toward the branches as a beast would leap for his prey, just beyond his reach. Then there would be a momentary hiss as the sap turned to steam, a flash like that of burning powder as the leaves took fire, and in an instant the entire tree would be in flames. Then would the flames leap from tree to tree, borne on the wings of the wind and with very near the rapidity of the wind, and in a few minutes the beautiful grove would be blackened, dismal forest of dry poles. Thus would the flames advance until some change in the wind drove them in another direction. The flames would insidiously work their way into the swamps and here develop almost a furnace heat, actually burning from 1 to 3 feet into the ground and completely burning out the peat, roots, and alluvial soil, leaving nothing but ashes and the subsoil of sand. Thus the fires lived and increased for weeks, until the dwellers in this section began to be terrified for the safety of their homes, their mills, and even their lives. The whole air was filled with a dense, suffocating smoke, almost obscuring the vision over a tract of hundreds of square miles. The sun shone down through the smoke with a red, angry glare, and the heavens at night would be illuminated on every side with the holocaust of fire. Observing it one evening from a canto, it seemed to us the most dismal picture we had ever looked upon. The air was thick and stifling with smoke. In the upper part of the city, a line of fire swept along the horizon, bringing out the intervening buildings in bold relief. Now and then a giant tree trunk, with its head glowing with fire and sending off flying sparks through the air, told of destruction and threatened the surrounding property. Off southerly, toward Pennsauken, was a dull glare visible through the smoke, and an occasional arrival that way told of miles of burning woods, of the destruction of railroad ties and of the telegraph line, and of threatened doom to Pennsauken. While we looked aghast at the dismal scene, a bright light shot across the eastern sky, and the whole heavens seemed ablaze in that direction. The fire was sweeping over the low meadows comprising many hundreds of acres, and halting but for a moment to lick up an occasional stack of hay. Some 200 or 300 tons of hay was burned on these marshes. We turned away to face a new quarter of danger. In another direction, and fearfully near the city, was a bright light, with now and then a tongue of flame shooting high up above the general glow. Repairing to that quarter, we found the flames advancing into the city, between it and the fairground, fanned by a fair wind and threatening several buildings. An alarm was struck, and a sleepless night and judicious fighting warded off the destroyer. Thus the city was encompassed by fire, and no one knew but in a few hours their homes would be reduced to ashes. We have given this case, not because of any remarkable circumstance connected with it, but to show what vigilance was required in all these bay-shore towns for at least a month to protect them from the devouring element. The case of Oconto was that of Little Swamico, Pennsauken, Peshtigo, Sturgeon Bay, and a score of other settlements. On 2 occasions the fires pressed so closely into Peshtigo that the village seemed almost inevitably doomed to destruction, but the most vigorous work saved it, and this had been the experience at Oconto. On Thursday, September 21st, the fires made so close a call for the village of Little Swamico that had the citizens accepted as fate that which seemed to be inevitable doom, not a house would have been saved there. Here is located the extensive sawmill of A.C. Kahn & Co. Seeing the danger, Mr. Kahn put his entire force at work hauling water, distributing barrels of water along the edge of the timber, and ditching. So close did the fire approach that the mill was several times on fire, and a large portion of the tram road leading to it was destroyed, but every building was saved. But not all were so fortunate. 2 or 3 of the railroad camps were destroyed, with their contents, and the laborers had hairbreadth escapes with their lives. Thousands of railroad ties were burned, and in some instances square timber for bridges was only saved by burying it in the sand. Communication from Green Bay northward, on the west shore of the bay, was now, about September 28th, almost entirely cut off by land, 20 miles of the telegraph line being destroyed, and there being miles of fire along the road. Eastward from Green Bay, the case was about as bad. End of chapters 1 and 2. Chapters 3 and 4 of Sketch of the Great Fires in Wisconsin by Frank Tilton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Verla Viera. Chapter 3. It is said that the prayer of the righteous availeth much, but we are sure that many prayers for the staying of the hand of the destroyer remained unanswered at this time. Whether we were all unrighteous, or lacking in faith, or doomed to chastisement for our sins, or for a solemn warning to the world, we leave to others to decide. Certain it is that the scourge of fire increased. For many miles in almost every direction from the city of Green Bay, scarce a farmer entirely escaped loss. Fences were destroyed, cordwood burned, and in some instances houses and barns, with the garnered crops, were swept away. Many farmers removed their household goods, hay, wood, etc., to the middle of their largest clearing, and then desperately fought the fire at every point of attack. The fire now extended, at intervals, from the Wolf River at the west to Lake Michigan on the east, a distance of about 70 miles, and from north to south for a distance of over 100 miles. Families began to move into the cities and villages from the country for safety, and to avoid the dense smoke, which, however, was nearly as bad there as in the country. Messengers continually came into Green Bay from the mills in the country for help to fight the fires, and a hard fight it proved indeed in many cases. The following items from the issue of the Green Bay Advocate of October 5th will give a good idea of the state of affairs in the woods at that time. Mill burned. Byron Holmes' steam sawmill on the Pensacola River, about 4 miles up from the mouth of the river, was entirely destroyed by fire on Tuesday morning, September 26th, at about 4 o'clock. Nothing was saved from the mill, not even the boxes of tools belonging to the mill hands. Mr. H., with all his men and teams, had been fighting fire for 4 or 5 days and nights, and supposed they had passed the great danger, and a part of them had lain down to get a little sleep, when the watchman gave the alarm of fire, which spread so rapidly that all the men and even women had all they could do to save the store, boarding-house, and adjoining buildings. Mr. H.'s loss in mill, lumber, shingles, etc., will be from $12,000 to $14,000, on which he held an insurance in the Republic, and the merchants of Chicago for $5,000, a part of which was on the boiler, which was not injured. George R. Cook came in from his mill in the town of Howard on Monday, pretty well used up from fighting fire all day Sunday and Sunday night. His mill and boarding-house had caught fire several times, but by great exertions the fire had been extinguished. Oscar Gray's mill in the town of Pittsfield had a narrow escape. He came in on Saturday night for extra hose to take out to the mill, and he and his men worked day and night to save the property. Some of the men had their eyebrows singed and their hair burned, so close was the conflict. 2 dwelling houses adjacent were burned. McLaren's new mill at Angelica, Shawano County, was safe at last accounts. At Foster and Arnold's mill, 14 miles west on the Shawano Road, the fire approached the mill from the south on Saturday night, and from that time until Monday morning the contest for saving the mill and buildings was a severe one. The mill was fortunately amply supplied with water from an artisan well, and was saved. Mr. Arnold thinks there has been great damage among the standing timber. On the Big Swamico, a large lot of logs in the bed of the river, amounting to over 130,000 feet, have been burned. They belong to Lamb, Watson & Co. and Mr. Tremble. Gross's mill at Little Swamico is reported burned. We hear no particulars. The report that Kahn's mill has been burned is not confirmed. At Oconto, at last accounts, the whole available population are out, resisting the inroads of the fire. Brunquist's barn, with a quantity of hay, was burned. At Marinette, the fire advanced so close to town that the Dunlap house was threatened, and the flying cinders were so thick that the people only protected their houses by the constant use of wet blankets and water. On the line of the Lake Pepin Railway, 3,000 ties and several hundred cords of wood are reported burned. The towns of Seymour, Bovina, and Black Creek, Outagamie County, are ravaged by the fire, and vast amounts of fences, hay, cordwood, and other property are lost. Anderson's mill in Seymour was saved with difficulty. East of here, the mills over which there had been the hardest struggle were Woodruff's and Sanford's. The last named was incorrectly reported burned on Sunday. Mr. Sanford sent into town on Saturday night and obtained a fresh relay of men, and it was reported out of danger Monday morning. Woodruff's mill is reported to have been on fire twice Sunday, but was saved with severe exertion. A house, occupied by Fred Louis, a German, about a mile north of that mill, was burned. At the charcoal kilns of the Green Bay Furnace, some 3 miles from here, 1,200 cords of wood have been burned. The country in the vicinity of what is known as Ritchie's Farm on the East Branch, some 4 miles from here, has sustained serious losses. Fences, haystacks, barns, and other property are burned. The report of last week that Delvaux's mill, near the Manitowoc Road east of here, was burned proves a mistake. The mill was saved, but he lost 300 cords of bolts, which was all his stock got out. Cook's mill at Lily Lake, on the eastern margin of this county, had a narrow escape. All the hands were stationed around the mill, removing underbrush and logs and digging trenches. They made a successful resistance for a day and 2 nights and placed the mill out of danger. The stage from Stiles, Oconto County, on Monday got through to this city with great difficulty on account of the fallen timber and dense smoke. The driver reports a large force hard at work at West Pensacola trying to save McGovern's Hotel and other buildings. Peters had his whole force at work to save his mill and adjoining property. Men, women, and children had turned out en masse to save their homes. Fred Scheller, who was at work with a force of men rebuilding a bridge on the Manitowoc Road about 4.5 miles from here, was compelled to abandon his work. All of the 3 bridges between here and Hum's Tavern, 4 miles out of town, were burned on Sunday. The circus, which went from here to Manitowoc that day, had the good fortune to pass there before they were burned. The tavern 4 miles from here, formerly owned by John Platten, was saved by plowing around it, but the fences in the vicinity are all burned. Mr. Scheller says that the falling of the burning trees was like a continual discharge of artillery. The loss to the timber is immense. The houses and barns are mostly saved, but fences, timber, and bridges are all swept off. The new culverts which have been built by Road Superintendent Delaney along the Manitowoc and other roads, made of large and heavy timber, have been nearly all burned. The fire running along and under the ground gets under them, and it is impossible to extinguish it. We also hear that most of the new plank road from the Upper East River Bridge eastward is destroyed. At Cooperstown, 18 miles east of here, several dwellings and barns and many stacks of wheat, hay, and oats were consumed. Added to these is the loss of timber cordwood, fences, hemlock bark, and other products of the forest. A team of horses and an Indian were burned to death near Oconto on Monday. At Oconto Falls, J. Volk's barn is destroyed, with all of D. McClure's logging apparatus. At the Pecor, Leland, and Belgian settlements, the fences are all destroyed, and all the buildings on the Pensacola Road between Redmond's and Holmes Mill are reported burned. A large force of men have been engaged for some days in fighting the fire just west of Mr. Elmore's residence in Fort Howard. Southward, on the west side of the river, the burning extends very nearly to Neenah. The ground is penetrated by the fire, which makes its way under the growing trees and uproots them. Fences and woodpiles along the railway are constantly burning. In this city, this Wednesday morning, the smoke is more dense than at any time before. The air is suffocating and is filled with flakes of ashes. On the bay, the steamers have to navigate by compass and blow their foghorns, the shores being invisible. An extra from the Oconto lumberman gives particulars of the fire in that neighborhood. Sunday was a day of wild excitement. 2 or 3 farmhouses at Stiles are burned. Little River shared in the general loss. James Lucas lost his hay and grain. James A. Glenn lost his logging camp, besides sleds and camp equipage. South of the Oconto, J. Dodge, W. O. Dodge, Henry Delano, and a Mr. Gardner had given up the battle against the fire and left their homes. Their houses are probably burned. Percy's farm, north of the river, is a sheet of flame. Other farms have shared the same fate, and Comstock and Simpson's mill is threatened. At Peshtigo, the houses of Charles Bartels, B.A.B. Burner, and Mr. Albright and barn of the latter are reported burned. In the same paper we find the following account of a battle with the flames at Peshtigo on Sunday, the 24th day of September, just 2 weeks before the destruction of the village. Peshtigo, September 27, 1871. Sabbath, the 24th instant, was an exciting, I might say a fearful, time in Peshtigo. For several days the fires had been raging in the timber near here, between this and Oconto, and to the north and east of us. On Friday, I came through from Oconto, and we were compelled to run our horses some distance with fire above us, and on either side of us, and barely escaped being singed. Saturday the fire burned through to the river about a mile above town, and Saturday night much danger was apprehended from the sparks and cinders that blew across the river into the upper part of town near the factory. A force was stationed along the river, and although fire caught in the new dust and dry slab several times, was promptly extinguished. It was a grand sight, the fire that night. It burned to the tops of the tallest trees, enveloped them in a mantle of flame, or winding itself about them like a huge serpent, crept to their tops, out upon the branches, and wound its huge folds about them, and hissing and glaring lapped out its myriad fiery tongues, while its fierce breath swept off the green leaves and roared through the forest like a tempest. Ever and anon some tall old pine, whose huge trunk had become a column of fire, fell with a thundering crash, filling the air with an ascending cloud of sparks and cinders, while above being a dense black cloud of resinous smoke, that, in its strong contrast to the light beneath, seemed to threaten death and destruction to all below. Thousands of birds, driven from their roost, flew about as if uncertain which way to go, and made night hideous by their startled cries. Frequently they would fly hither and thither, calling loudly for their mates, then hovering for a moment in the air, suddenly dart downward and disappear in the fiery furnace beneath. Thus the night wore away while we earnestly hoped, and many hearts fervently prayed, for rain. Sunday morning the fires had died down, so that we began to hope that the danger had passed. About 11 a.m., while we were sitting in the church, prepared to listen to an interesting sermon, the minister having just announced his text, and launched out under "Firstly," the steam whistle of the factory blew a wild blast, which told us that there was danger from terrestrial fires more immediately pressing than from those infernal, and we incontinently left the minister there and rushed out to see what was the matter. Fire had caught in the sawdust near the factory again, but before we reached the spot it was extinguished. The wind had suddenly risen and was blowing a gale from the northwest. The fires in the timber were burning more fiercely than ever, and were approaching the river directly opposite the factory. The air was literally filled with the burning coals and cinders, which fell and caught frequently, and the utmost diligence was necessary to prevent them from spreading. The engine was brought out, and hundreds of pails from the factory were manned, and everything that was possible done to prevent the fire from entering the town. But now a new danger arose. The fires to the west of the town and south of the Oconto Road were approaching the town rapidly, and it seemed that nothing short of a miracle could save the village from utter destruction. A cloud of hot, blinding smoke blew in our faces and made it extremely difficult to see or do anything, but prompt and energetic means were taken to check the approaching flames. Mr. Ellis, superintendent of the Peshtigo Company, with Messrs. Shepherd, Beebe, Hempstead, Burns, and others of our citizens, labored incessantly. The company's teams were set to hauling water, and the whole force of over 300 of the laborers in the factory and mills were on the ground, besides other citizens. Goods were packed up and moved from buildings supposed to be in most danger, and a general conflagration seemed inevitable. I have seen fire sweep over the prairies with the speed of a locomotive, and the prairie fire is grand and terrible, but beside a timber fire it sinks into insignificance. In proportion as the timber is denser and heavier and loftier than the prairie grass, is the timber fire intenser, hotter, grander than the prairie fire. The fire on the prairie before a high wind will rush on and lap up the light dead grass, and it is done in a breath. In the timber it may move almost as rapidly, but the fire goes not out with the advance waves which sweep over the tops of the trees and catches the light limbs and foliage. Nor is there the same chance to resist the approach of fire in the timber. It is as though you attempted to resist the approach of an avalanche of fire hurled against you. With the going down of the sun, the wind abated, and with it the fire. Timber was felled and wet with the water thrown over it. Buildings were covered with wet blankets, and all under the scorching heat, and in blinding, suffocating smoke that was enough to strangle one, and thus passed the night of Sunday. Monday the wind veered to the south and cleared away the smoke. Strange to say, not a building was burned. The town was saved. Monday the factory was shut down to give the men rest, and on Tuesday it was only partially run. The fire swept round the town and burned over the marshes between this and Marinette, destroying large quantities of hay. The whole force of 200 hands were out at the harbor to keep off the fire from the marsh, where the company had hundreds of tons of hay, and they barely succeeded in saving it. At the present writing, all is quiet and moving forward as usual. In the city of Green Bay and borough of Fort Howard, across the river, there was a continued fearful apprehension of danger. All were suffering more or less by the effect of the dense smoke upon their lungs and their eyes. Indeed, the eyes of many were so badly affected that it was several weeks before they entirely recovered. By day, flakes of white ashes were continually falling in the streets like snow, and now and then, if the wind blew high, partially burned leaves would fall. A settled gloom fell upon the whole community, and scarce a man or woman but who, before retiring at night, would go out and gaze ruefully upon the red glare in the heavens to the east, west, and south of us, estimate the distance of the flames, and take note of the direction and force of the wind. Indeed, more than once the flames entered the limits of the city of Green Bay and borough of Fort Howard, snatching here and there a fence, a haystack, or a pile of cordwood. Did a bell ring, or was there any unusual noise in the streets, everybody listened breathlessly, lest it be an alarm of fire. Thus sped the days, fearful days, but they brought no relief. Quote, "The sky was brass, the earth was ashes." End quote. Chapter 4. We have attempted to portray in the preceding chapter the state of the public mind, and can only add that each succeeding day but intensified the feeling of dread of coming calamity. The morning of October 8, 1871, dawned, so far as we could tell through the thick pall of smoke, cloudlessly, and the hopes of rain we had cherished were feeble. An unusual solemnity seemed to rest upon the whole community on that Sabbath day, born of an undefined fear. It was as if a voice vaguely whispered to the mind of awful calamity to come somewhere and by some means, but gave no explanations of the manner and suggested no means of avoidance. A solemn tone pervaded the sermons of the pastors of the various churches, and the listeners were unusually attentive. Evening came, and the glowing banks of fire seemed no nearer than on the evening previous. The smoke was no more dense, but occasional hot puffs of wind were felt in our streets, sometimes startlingly hot, as if the breath of a furnace. But the night passed quietly, and the morning of Monday dawned as other mornings had. There would have been few sleepy eyes that night had we known the awful carnival of death that was raging around us. The first intimation in Green Bay of the fearful destruction on that Sunday night was the arrival in town of Mr. George W. Watson, of this city, of the firm of Lamb, Watson & Co., with the intelligence of the entire destruction of the flourishing settlement of New Franken, about 12 miles northeast of the city of Green Bay, in Brown County. He brought with him some of the refugees from that place, and his haggard, smoke-begrimed appearance and red and inflamed eyes told of the fearful struggle he had had with the fire. We will let him tell the story in his own words. Mr. F. Tilton. Dear Sir, in compliance with your request, I will give you a sketch of a trip that I took through the burned district, what I saw of the late fire, its effects, etc. On Saturday, October 7, 1871, G.A. Lawton, cashier of the National Bank of Commerce of Green Bay, and I started with a team and buckboard for Kewanee, a little village situated on the shores of Lake Michigan, a distance of about 36 miles from Green Bay. We reached New Franken, which is only 12 miles from Green Bay, at about 1:00 p.m. Here we stopped, fed our team, and took an active part in supplying our temporal wants with roast goose, etc. Here was the first fire that we had seen. There was a little fire lingering here and there in the woods, which had been burning for 2 weeks previous. At times it came very near getting the start of the men who were watching it day and night, but so far the wind had been favorable, and they had succeeded in keeping it back, and it was then nearly out. New Franken was a small village, or hamlet, consisting of one lumber and shingle mill, which was conceded by all who have visited it as being as convenient and as ingeniously constructed as any mill in the state. One store, which was always well filled with merchandise and customers. The usual stock of goods kept on hand was about $6,000. There was also one large boarding house, which would accommodate about 100 men, 2 large frame barns, several small barns, and about a dozen tenant houses, and one 2-story frame house occupied by Willard Lamb, who was the owner of the above-described property. There was also one schoolhouse, one wagon and blacksmith shop, owned by Anton Burkhardt, and a post office. At about 3 p.m. we started on for Kewanee. There was fire in the woods and along the line of the road nearly all the way to Kewanee. In some instances, we were obliged to run our horses to get through the fire. We saw in several instances the ruins of what a week before were fine frame houses and barns, well filled with provisions, hay, grain, etc. Also, several schoolhouses and many miles of fences were burned on both sides of the road. We reached Kewanee about 7:00 p.m., where we met Honorable E. Decker, in whose charge we willingly placed ourselves for safekeeping for the night. The next morning, about 7 o'clock, we, in company with Mr. Decker, started back for Green Bay. We drove by the way of Casco, a little hamlet owned by Mr. Decker, about 14 miles from Kewanee. We expected to find it burned up, as a report came to Mr. Decker the night before, about 10 p.m., that it was in great danger, but through the energy of a few men that Mr. Decker had there watching, they succeeded in subduing the fire somewhat, and there were then no serious apprehensions of any further danger. We only halted there a few minutes, and were soon on our way. We arrived at New Franken about 2:00 p.m. Here we fed our team and took dinner, and about 5 p.m. were ready for a start for home. My sister, Mrs. Lamb, said to me that she felt very much concerned about the fire, that she feared they would have trouble before morning, and wished me to stop until then, as Mr. Lamb was away from home, and there was no man around that could take charge except my father, who was completely exhausted by being up nearly all the time, night and day, for nearly 2 weeks previous. She said that if I would stay with them that night, if all was well in the morning, she would send a man with their team to take me home. I did not apprehend any more danger that night than at any other time during the past 2 weeks, but as she was so urgent in her request for me to stop, I finally consented, and the others of the party drove home that night. After they had gone, I went out with my father and took a general survey of the fire, and stationed about a dozen men here and there to watch until midnight, and then had men engaged to relieve them. We went to the house and were about to sit down to supper, when one of the watchmen came running in and told us that the whole country south of the mill was on fire, about 1 mile distant, and that it was coming at a rapid rate directly toward the place. I told him that there would not be any danger of fire from that direction, as the whole country had recently been burned over, and that the fire could not run a second time over the same ground. But we did not stop long to argue, but rushed out to investigate and found that the report was true. The fire was absolutely coming, at a frightful rate, over the same ground that had previously burned before. It seemed as though every tree in the woods was on fire. The wind commenced to rise, and the fire spread from tree to tree, in some instances 20 to 30 rods in advance of the fire on the ground. It seemed as though the heavens were on fire. The fire struck the village about 7 o'clock. The wind was blowing a gale from the southwest. It first took in a log barn, from there it spread to a small dwelling, and then to about 3,000 cords of wood, then to the barns, and then to the mill, from there to 5 small tenant houses. I thought that if the wind held where it was, that we could save 1 barn, the boarding house, the private house which was occupied by W. Lamb, and the store. But as there was no certainty in anything, I hitched up Mr. Lamb's carriage team, took a few things, and then drove out west about half a mile and put them in a farmer's barn, and then went back. While I was gone, they loaded 2 teams and sent them out. The fire caught in 3 farmhouses and 2 barns, which were only about 40 rods west of the store, on the road that I had just passed over. I narrowly escaped burning up in attempting to get back to where my folks were. As soon as I did, I told them that we must make an attempt to get out, or we must all surely perish. By this time, the women were in a perfect panic. It was with much difficulty that I got them started. There was no way of escape only south of the village, through the burning timber for about half a mile, and then west to intersect the main road where I had previously left my team. It was a long time before I could induce the ladies to try the woods. They said they would burn up, that the trees would fall on them, etc., but they soon saw that to remain where they were would be sure death, and so they consented to follow me. I ran ahead, and where the fire was too hot would return and try another course, and by so doing got along nicely until we had got nearly through, when I discovered that the fire had leaped from the main fire a distance of several rods, and was running from where it last took fire at the speed of a racehorse. I could see that unless we got through the gap, which was only a few rods ahead of us, that our time had come, and that in 5 minutes or less we would be numbered with the many hundreds who had perished. But I succeeded in getting them through safe, and in less than 3 minutes the gap was closed up. The ladies all fell on their faces, completely exhausted, but it soon became too hot there, and they were again rallied, and we walked about 80 rods through a plowed field, and came out where I had left my team a short time previous. They then walked west about 80 rods, while I was hitching up the team, and by the time I got to Casper Showers, only about 80 rods distance, the barn that I had just taken my team out of was all in flames. By this time, all the buildings were on fire at the mill. I saw that there was nothing more could be done, that all was gone, and so I took my 3 sisters into my buggy and started for Green Bay. I arrived there at 5 o'clock in the morning. The ladies were so sick that they were obliged to be led and carried into my house. As soon as I could get a little breakfast, I drove back to the ruins. There was nothing standing to indicate that there was ever a building at New Franken. There were about 20 families burned out. There were 15 farmhouses burned by the same fire, the farthest not more than 1/2 mile from New Franken. There were at the time of the fire about 80 men, women, and children residing at New Franken, and not one life was lost. This seems almost like a miracle when we consider the extent of the fire and the rapidity with which it came upon the people. This same fire continued in a northeasterly direction for about 20 miles, sweeping everything before it. It traveled at the rate of 8 miles per hour. To illustrate the rapidity of the fire, I will give you a description of how Michael Heim, a farmer, and his family escaped from being burned up. He resided about 1/2 mile northeast of New Franken. He had a nice farmhouse and barn, about 400 bushels of wheat in his barn, and a large quantity of hay, several head of cattle, and a nice pair of horses. The first he knew of the fire approaching was from the light that shone into his room. He sprang out of bed, ran out, and he says the woods and the heavens were all on fire. He ran to the barn, took his horses out, and drove them a short distance away in his field, and running back took his 3 little children in their night clothes, and his wife and a pail of water, and ran into the middle of the clearing. They had got a few rods from the house when the flames struck it. The heat was so intense, and the atmosphere was so completely filled with sparks, that had it not been for the water that he took along, they would all have burned up. Their clothes would take fire, but by the use of the water the fire would soon be extinguished. In this way they saved their lives, but lost every dollar of their property. As soon as the barn was nicely on fire, the horses ran in and were burned. Respectfully yours, George W. Watson. End of chapters 3 and 4. Chapters 5 and 6 of Sketch of the Great Fires in Wisconsin by Frank Tilton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Verla Viera. Chapter 5. The last chapter portrays in plain and truthful words the fate of New Franken. At sunset, a thriving, prosperous village. At midnight, a blackened, desolate waste, its inhabitants hungry, half-naked, and without shelter, seeking a place to lay their heads and finding none. This would seem to be horror enough for one day, but it was scarcely a commencement. By continual arrivals from places on the east shore of the bay, we soon learned that the fate of New Franken was the fate of a large portion of the settlements on the peninsula, with the exception of the lamentable fact that in these places there was great loss of life. The city of Green Bay, the headquarters for news, was stirred to its center by the sad reports continually coming in. Messengers from Brown, Kewaunee, Dorr, and Manitowoc counties came in with news of death and desolation. Anxious people eagerly inquired of every newcomer as to the safety of their particular friends, and many, unable to restrain their impatience, started for the country towns to investigate for themselves. When the city was aroused to fever heat by the news of the calamity, there was flashed over the wires the startling report, "Chicago is burning!" It was true. The fire demon, not content with his work of destruction here, had at the same hour on that Sunday night applied his torch to that beautiful city and dissipated the principal portion of it in ashes and smoke. Chicago was the pride of the West. It was typical of Western enterprise and energy, and it was a sad day indeed when its magnificent marble buildings and its millions of wealth melted away as the frostwork on the window panes. All business was comparatively forgotten here, and no one cared to hear of aught but the news of the fires. The telegraph was monopolized by its recital, and the presses of the city were taxed to their utmost in printing extras containing the fearful news. Our own kindred calamity made us feel more deeply the sufferings of our Chicago neighbors. The day wore on, and when the evening came we fondly hoped that we had heard the last of the chapter of fire. But not so. The few items of the work of the destroyer that we had heard were but as the evening twilight before the blackness of night. On Monday evening the steamer Union, Captain Thomas Hawley, arrived at Green Bay from Menominee, bringing the fearful and heart-sickening news that the village of Peshtigo was entirely destroyed by fire Sunday evening, and that the bodies of from 50 to 60 of its citizens lay dead in the streets. Also that the village of Menoconee was swept away. The report seemed too horrible for credence, yet there were those on board the steamer who had been witnesses of the terrible scene at Peshtigo. We could but hope that in the excitement of the moment the number of the dead had been overstated. Would that fate had decreed it so. But alas, in this case the error was on the other side. Before attempting any description of this crowning calamity, let us look for a moment at the village of Peshtigo, that we may better understand its situation. Peshtigo village lay on both sides of the Peshtigo River, that at this point ran nearly south, was 7 miles from the mouth of the river, and connected with the harbor and mill at the mouth of the river by a railroad. The village was about 50 miles north of the city of Green Bay by road. Peshtigo may be said to have been the creation of Honorable William B. Ogden of Chicago, the leading spirit of the Peshtigo Company, and everything about it bore his impress. Possessed of immense means, he had but to see where an improvement was necessary or advisable, and the improvement was immediately made. The harbor, to a great extent artificial, is one of the very best on Green Bay. The mill at the harbor is the largest in this section of the country, and perhaps equal to any in Wisconsin, averaging a daily cut of 150,000 feet of lumber and running 97 saws. The railroad was a good one, was owned by the company, and employed in carrying the product of the factories at the village to the harbor, carrying up supplies and the transportation of passengers. At the village was an immense manufactory of woodenware, a lumber mill, and sash, door, and blind factory, a machine shop, a grist mill, a large store, and a boarding house belonging to the company, and a large number of tenant houses also owned by the company. There were also a large sawmill owned by Nicholas Cavoy, a foundry owned by David Lister, a wagon and blacksmith shop owned by E. Kittner, and another by Edward Dress. John Farrell and Edward Goose owned shoemaker shops, and O. Carney and Brother and Albert Phillips each livery stables. There was also the following hotels, stores, and business houses: the Peshtigo Hotel, owned and occupied by Woodward and Heath, Charles Woodward, and Wallace W. Heath. Jacobs House, Charles Jacobs, proprietor. Forest House, John B. Dress, proprietor. Hotel de France, Joseph Grigi, proprietor. George Robinson, groceries, provisions, and butcher shop. Fred W. Bartels, groceries, dry goods, clothing, etc. Harder and Horvath, W. Philotro, manager, clothing and furnishing goods. David Dix, groceries and provisions. Dr. Kelsey, apothecary and physician. Charles Johnson, dry goods, groceries, clothing, etc. McDonald and Murray, grocers. Nicholas Cavoy, grocery and butcher shop. T.A. Hay, jeweler. P.J. Marshall, groceries, dry goods, boots, and shoes. Williams Brothers, hardware and tinware. G.J. Tisdale, attorney and counselor. J. Lave, wholesale and retail liquors. John Stewart, boarding house and saloon. Philip Andre and Company, boarding house and saloon. William Henderson, barber. J. Baskin, saloon. There were also 2 churches, the Congregational and Roman Catholic, both fine frame buildings, and a large and very handsome schoolhouse, built with a view to the ornamental as well as practical. The woodenware factory was perhaps the largest institution of the kind under one roof in the United States. It ran 2 hand shingle machines, a large circular saw, a small circular siding mill, 2 cross-cut cut-off saws, 2 bench saws, a bottom saw, 3 pail stave saws, 2 tub stave saws, 2 cannikin stave saws, 2 tub lathes, 1 kit lathe, 1 cannikin lathe, a churn lathe, 3 pail lathes, 3 broom handle lathes, 4 clothespin lathes, 1 planer, 1 hoop planer, 1 hoop saw, 2 bottom sizing saws, 1 bottom planer, 2 jointers, 5 bottom lathes, 3 hoop rollers, 5 hoop cutters, 2 broom handle saws, 1 cross-cut saw, 1 churn cover saw, 2 pail bale machines, 1 tub bale machine, and 2 paint mills. The whole building was 341 feet long. The main part 4 stories high and 60 feet wide. The sawmill 3 stories, shingle mill 2 stories, and all but the main part 50 feet wide. In addition to this, there were 16 brick dry kilns, a storehouse 140 by 60 feet and 4 stories, another 126 by 40 feet and 2.5 stories, paint grinding mill 18 by 30 feet. The whole concern was run by an immense engine in a fireproof apartment, heated by steam, and no light was ever allowed in the building. The capacity of the woodenware factory was about as follows: 600 pails, 170 tubs, 200 cannikin, 250 fish kits, 200 keelers, 5,000 broom handles, 50 boxes clothespins, 45,000 shingles, 8 dozen barrel covers, 260 tobacco pails, 200 paint pails per day. Over 200 hands were employed. The machinery was all of the most novel and approved description, and the work turned out was famous for its excellence. The sash, door, and blind factory and sawmill was on the same large scale and was run by water power. So much for the manufactories of Peshtigo. As these establishments were always running, money was plenty, and the spirit of enterprise could not but be noticed by every stranger. The village was rapidly growing and assuming considerable importance among the thriving towns of the Bay Shore. We are not able to state the precise population of the village proper, nor even of the town, which included the principal part of the sugar bush settlements, or farming country surrounding the village on the west and northwest. According to the census of 1870, the population of the town of Peshtigo was 1,750, but all accounts agree that it was considerably greater at the time of the fire. It was in general a good, quiet, contented, and thriving community, largely composed of native-born American citizens. Chapter 6. Sunday, October 8th, in Peshtigo, passed as other Sundays had. The dense smoke told of fires in almost every direction surrounding the village, but so they had for weeks, and in general there was no especial fear of disaster that night. But we hear of individual cases where a fear of impending danger seemed to take deep root in the mind. It seemed as if a warning of the calamity, although dim and undefined, had been given to some. Said a lady who perished that night, to a friend whom she met on the street just before dark, "I am afraid we shall all burn up tonight." Alas, how sadly her expectations were realized in her own case. As we remarked, the smoke was dense and overpowering. It was almost impossible to distinguish a face the width of the street in distance. But the churchgoers went to church and listened to the preaching of the Word of God. Perhaps, as they picked their way home, they thought of the inspired words, quote, "I will never leave thee, nor forsake thee." End quote. Perhaps others may have thought of the doom of Sodom and Gomorrah, for whose destruction God, quote, "rained down fire from heaven." End quote. Others there were who, thoughtless of any duty or of fealty to a higher power, spent the evening in the pursuit of pleasure or the gratification of their own lusts, and still others, looking forward to a week of toil ahead, were taking advantage of that quiet Sabbath evening for rest. The wind had been very light through the afternoon, but breezed up into quite a stiff gale, blowing for a short time and then dying down to a perfect calm. This calm is spoken of as being something almost unnatural. It was like the silence of the grave. Some who were in the streets at this time mentioned that they took note of a substance in the air falling thickly, like snowflakes, but which proved on inspection to be ashes. Still, the thought of danger did not enter the minds of the people. One by one, the lights that had glimmered through the window panes were extinguished. Babes lay tranquilly on their mothers' bosoms, and alike the virtuous and the vicious were seeking the God-given boon of sleep. Through the dense smoke could be seen to the south of the town a dull red glare near the horizon. Again a breeze sprang up from the southwest, and the air was hot as a sirocco. Then came a low rumbling noise, like the distant approach of a train of cars. The noise increased to a heavy roar, variously described as like the noise of thunder or a mighty wind, and the startled people rushed into the streets to ascertain the cause. The long dread of fire that had been the bane of the days and the terror of the nights at once suggested to most minds what the danger really was. Mothers hastily snatched their children from their beds and partially dressed them. Some had long had their valuables packed in trunks in anticipation of fire, and others began to pack up their goods. The men mustered in squads and prepared to fight the fire. And now, at about 10 o'clock, great tongues of flame were seen leaping high in the air above the treetops and rapidly approaching the village. The roar increased, and burning coals began to drop in the village, first like stray meteors of the night, and then as thickly as the snows of winter. Many of the survivors represent that the shower of coals was as dense as a heavy snowstorm. In less time than it takes to write it, the wind had reached the force of a tornado, the buildings nearest the woods were on fire, and the very air seemed an atmosphere of flame. It was evident from the outset to those who stopped to think that under these circumstances there was no salvation for the buildings of the village. But so eager are men for the safety of their worldly goods that many lingered near their buildings, and some of them saw their error too late for escape. As if by a common instinct, all seemed to rush toward the river, which ran through the center of the village. The prevailing idea seemed to be, with the dwellers on either side, that the other side would escape. Hence the rush for the bridge. In general, there was no waiting for ceremony. Women with their children hastened toward the river, while their husbands lingered at home, in hopes to be able to save house or property, and thus families were separated, neither party knowing whether the other were saved or lost until after the fire. Many were awakened from slumber by the crackling of the flames and the burning of their own dwellings, and escaped, if happily they escaped at all, with only their night-clothes on. The bridge was soon on fire, and here was an awful scene, parties on each side suffering with the withering heat, and hoping to reach the other, where they fancied they could find safety, but unable to do so. For large numbers of them, the river was the only resort, and they plunged in, some to drown, and others to escape after enduring the most fearful tortures. Scores failed to reach the river at all. Strangled by the smoke, or foul gases, or both, they fell, and their charred and shriveled bodies, lying on the streets, presented a ghastly and horrible sight next morning. Others, a considerable portion of the saved, succeeded in reaching a low, marshy piece of ground on the east side of the river, below the residence of Mr. W. A. Ellis, where they escaped comparatively unharmed. Some were burned to death within a few feet of the river, some in their houses, some in the woods, and some on the roads attempting to escape. But the difficulty of escape was so great that it is almost impossible to comprehend it. Within half an hour, and some say within 10 minutes, of the time the first building caught fire, the entire village was in flames. The great sheets of fire curled and rolled over the ground like breakers on a reef. Overhead, the air seemed to be on fire. The smoke was so dense that it was next to impossible to see which way to go, and had it not been so, the choice of a place of safety was mere guesswork. At one moment, the whole earth would be lighted up with almost the brightness of day, and at the next, the darkness would be almost total. Add to this the effect of the tornado, which was so severe as to unroof buildings, to throw the fugitives upon the ground and hurl them about like straws, and some idea may be formed of the difficulties of the situation. There were points where a brief stand was made against the fire by the daring ones. At the wooden-ware factory, which but for the tornado accompanying the fire might have been saved, the engine was at work, and Mr. Thomas Burns, foreman in charge, with others, was wetting down the buildings with the fire apparatus, until the hopelessness of the case became so apparent that they were obliged to leave, and with great difficulty saved their own lives. So also at the boarding-house, a strange hallucination seemed to prevail that it could be saved, and a large number of people took refuge there. On the opposite side of the street was the fire-engine house, and the engine was taken out, the hose stretched across the street, and water thrown on the boarding-house. The number who gathered inside the boarding house is variously estimated at from 30 to 75 persons. When the flames struck the building, the whole front was on fire in an instant. It was in fact completely surrounded with whirling, writhing coils of flame. The hapless inmates had their choice between an atmosphere of fire without and the hell of fire within, and it mattered little which they chose, as few of them could have succeeded in crossing the street to the river. A heap of undistinguishable calcined bones and charred flesh in the ruins of the building, giving no clue to sex or number, was all that remained. That was a horrible night, and one which the survivors can never look back upon without heart-sickness. Standing in the cold water of the river, or clinging to logs, sometimes the logs on fire, were men, women, and children, gasping for breath, their eyes blinded by smoke, and saving themselves from burning even in the water only by covering their heads with blankets which they kept wet, or wetting their heads continually. The roar of the tornado and of the fire was mingled with shrieks of anguish from the suffering, and groans and lamentations from those bereaved of relatives and friends. Cattle, too, rushed into the river and swam about bewildered, sometimes rolling over the logs to which wretched human beings were clinging, and sending them to a watery grave. Before the morning dawned, the entire village of Peshtigo, with the single exception of an unfinished building, was utterly swept out of existence, and the ground a desert waste, strewn with blackened and hideous corpses, singly or in groups, more or less mutilated. Of the lost, and of some of the remarkable cases of escape, we shall speak hereafter. Before daylight came, the flames had so far subsided that the survivors were able to get out of the river and leave their retreat on the marshy flat, and they ventured forth through the hot sand in quest of relatives and friends, now and then stumbling in the darkness over the bodies of the victims. Others gathered around a heap of burning coal to dry their clothes and warm themselves, and others about the still-burning materials at the pail factory. Finally the sun arose, casting a red, lurid glare through the smoke upon the scene. And the horrors of that scene no pen can portray. The west side of the river, where all the stores but that of the Peshtigo Company had stood, together with all the hotels, the Roman Catholic Church, and many private residences, was bleak, desolate prairie. The very location of the streets almost a matter of doubt, and the only thing we can remember seeing standing above the ground were the iron works of 2 locomotives and a number of car wheels. On the east side of the river stood numerous car trucks, the walls of the brick dry kilns of the woodenware factory, the stone walls of the engine and boiler rooms of the factory proper, and an unfinished dwelling house. Here lay a group of father, mother, and children, their clothes all gone and their bodies shriveled up to 2/3 their natural size. There the body of a woman, there a man, there a child, a fair-haired boy, recognized as the child of Mr. Tanner, found in a kneeling posture as if in the attitude of prayer, his head bent down upon his hands, and his body completely roasted. And there were groups lying all around the side of the village, some of the bodies with their limbs burned off, all of them naked, and with one exception, all lying on their faces. 2 of the bodies found were those of a woman lying on her face and clasping an infant in her arms, in her attempt to shield it from the fire. There were about 70 bodies found that morning in the streets, besides the carcasses of horses, cattle, and dogs strewn promiscuously about. We leave our readers to picture, if they can, the grief of parents that morning on recognizing the bodies of their idolized children, and of a husband when he distinguished the blackened, unsightly remains of his beloved wife, and the agony, mingled with faint hope, of those whose dear ones were among the missing. To illustrate the sweeping work of the destroyer, we will instance the sad fate of a tea party that had assembled that Sunday afternoon at the house of Mr. L. Tyler in the village. The guests were Daniel McGregor and wife, Jenny McGregor, sister of Daniel, Nellie Marshall, daughter of P.J. Marshall, Ira Washburn, the wife of Mr. Philbrook, and William Thompson and his wife. Of these 8 persons, all perished but Mr. Washburn and Mrs. Philbrook. A sad thought indeed for the survivors of that pleasant social gathering. End of chapters 5 and 6. Chapter 7 of Sketch of the Great Fires in Wisconsin by Frank Tilton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Verla Viera. Chapter 7. The coming of the morning, while it brought exemption from the actual horrors of fire, was accompanied by new tortures. Most of the survivors were not more than half clad, and had been standing in the cold water of the river for several hours. Add to this the fact that numbers of them were fearfully burned, and no shelter, bandages, or medicine to be had, and that large numbers were blind from the effects of the heat and smoke, and some idea can be formed of the discomforts of the situation. Then, too, the pangs of hunger began to be added to the list of troubles. Many of the survivors breakfasted from a patch of turnips that they dug from the ground, and others went hungry. Foremost and most active among the survivors, and ever to be remembered for his kindness of heart, was John Mulligan. After he had looked over the ground and fully comprehended the complete desolation and destitution, he started on foot for Marinette, 6.5 miles distant, to convey the news and procure supplies. Arriving there, he made application to Messrs. I. Stevenson and A. C. Brown of the N. Luddington Company, and soon had provisions and teams to take them to Peshtigo. The first intimation Mr. Stevenson had of the disaster was from Mr. Mulligan, who asked him if he could have something for the people at Peshtigo to eat. "Why," said Mr. S., "what is the matter at Peshtigo?" "My God," said Mr. M., "don't you know that not a stick of the village is standing, and 50 or 60 of the people lie dead in the streets?" This was enough to stir up the good people of Marinette, and they immediately did all they could to alleviate the sufferings of their fellows. It was only by great exertion that Marinette had been saved from the flames the same night, and they, with the people of Menominee, already had their hands full to provide for the homeless in Menaconi. But we must return to the people of Peshtigo. In the morning, many who were able walked 7 miles down to the settlement at the harbor, the fire in that direction having extended only about half a mile. Large numbers of others were taken over to Marinette by teams, and the Dunlap House, the largest hotel in that place, was generously turned over by its proprietor, J. M. Bellinger, as a hospital. Several of the citizens of Peshtigo village owned farms in the sugar bush, and thought to find shelter there. In one case, at least, one of the sufferers in the village went out to his farm, only to find the house in ashes. After daylight, stragglers began to pour in from the sugar bush farming settlements, and the reports they brought of the desolation and death there were so unutterably horrible as to throw into the background even the disaster at the village. They told of square miles of flourishing farming settlements utterly depopulated, of houses and barns swept away, and of scores and hundreds of dead bodies in the roads and fields. All this proved too true. In the entire extent of the 3 sugar bush settlements, but 8 houses, those of A. Phillips, A. Place, John Hutchins, and Jacob Empey in the upper, Mr. Federley in the lower, and Daniel Sage and Joseph Ballier in the middle, and Charles Swartz in the outskirts of the village, were left standing, and the loss of life was horrible in the extreme. The descriptions of the fire here are similar to those of the fire in the village. There was the same ominous roar preceding it, the same tornado carrying everything before it, and the same appearance of the air being on fire. But we hear other and different descriptions of the fire, and print one below as a sample. So many trustworthy men describe the same appearance that we give credit to the statement, believing that science will, if it has not already, account for the phenomena. Says Alfred Griffin of the Lower Sugar Bush, quote, "When I heard the roar of the approaching tornado, I ran out of my house and saw a great black, balloon-shaped object whirling through the air over the tops of the distant trees, approaching my house. When it reached the house, it seemed to explode with a loud noise, belching out fire on every side, and in an instant my house was on fire in every part." End quote. G. H. Brooks makes a similar statement. He went out of his back door to see the approaching storm, saw a similar cloud or ball approaching, and then ran into the house and with difficulty closed the door, so strong was the wind. The ball had by this time reached the house and exploded with a loud noise, filling the air with great sheets of flame. A stream of fire entered his house through the crack under the back door, and swept through the house to the front door. Of course the house was ablaze in an instant from foundation to roof, the family barely escaping with their lives, supremely happy to do that. We visited the place afterwards. The house stood at a considerable distance from the woods, so far that in any ordinary fire it would have been perfectly safe. But here were remaining but the stone walls of the cellar, dilapidated stoves, melted stovepipe, and broken crockery. Where the barn had stood were the carcasses of horses. The charred remains of several hogs showed where the sty had been. The bodies of fowls were all about the premises, and to complete the picture, there lay the partially burned bodies of the dog and the cat. Thus it will be seen that every living creature here perished but the human beings, who escaped in a neighboring ravine. The story of this family is similar to that of many others. To a person who has not visited the scene of destruction, it is unaccountable that so many lives were lost. Such a one has only to look over the ground when the subject of his wonderment will change entirely, and he will be astonished that so many were saved. Here was a long stretch of country completely cleared of trees on either side of the road for several miles in length, and from say a half mile to 2 miles in width, the clearings being farms, and the farmhouses built along the road. No ordinary fire in the woods could have done more than destroy fences and burn an occasional house, but here we find boulders of rock in the middle of large clearings, cracked to pieces by the heat, and the stumps so completely burned out that the roots, even to the small fibers, are gone, and holes are left in the ground where the stumps had been. Under these circumstances, the query must arise, how could any human life be saved? We confess that we cannot answer it. Talking with a large number of the survivors, we find that they attribute their safety either to the guidance of God or to mere chance. We have not heard one assert that his safety was caused by any superior skill of his own. We have examined the places where many were saved and many lost, and find as a general rule that those who selected the highest points of land to flee to perished, while those who took the depressed places, or sheltered themselves beneath the bank of some stream, escaped. Thus the brow of a knoll would be strewn with dead, while on the leeward side of it lives would be saved. It seems to have been certain death for a person to attempt to stand upright, no matter how far from the woods. The saved lay prone upon the ground, and in most cases dug holes in the earth with their hands, to which they put their mouths in order to breathe. To show the utter impossibility of accounting for the destruction in any ordinary manner, we cite the case of the destruction of the family of Charles Lamp in the lower sugar bush. When the danger came, Mr. Lamp, a farmer, hitched up his team to his wagon, got his wife and family into the wagon, and started for Peshtigo village. They had got out on the main road and were driving along at a point where the nearest woods must have been a half-mile from them, when a burning fence rail flying through the air struck one of his horses and knocked it down. Mr. Lamp got off of his wagon and assisted the horse to arise, and getting back spoke to his family and found they were all dead. He was then fearfully burned and hastily made his escape. Next morning on that spot were found the irons of the wagon and the charred bodies of 6 human beings. Several small streams ran through the sugar bushes, and in these as well as in Peshtigo River the fish were killed, even where human lives were saved. It is hardly probable that they were killed by the heat or by breathing the fire, and if their death was caused by breathing smoke and foul gases, how did any man escape the same fate? This is a problem that we, being unable to solve, leave for our readers. The forests in the sugar bush, which were largely composed of maple trees, give evidence of the tremendous force of the winds, the heaviest trees being uprooted or twisted off. A tree remaining standing in the central track of the storm is an exception to the general rule. They lay piled up in every conceivable shape, and not more than 15 or 20 remain standing on an acre. The smaller limbs are burned to ashes, and the trunks are charred and blackened. But notwithstanding this evidence of the great force of the wind, it is evident from the time the tornado struck the sugar bush, Peshtigo, and the Menominee River, that its forward motion did not exceed from 5 to 7 miles per hour. The inference is, therefore, that the wind moved in a circling eddy, slowly advancing. We think it is equally capable of proof that the wind, during this tornado, was highly charged with an inflammable gas, noxious to human life. Large numbers of the dead had no marks of fire about them. They might, it is true, have been suffocated with smoke, but the probabilities are otherwise. Mr. L. Tyler tells us that in his escape to the river at Peshtigo village, he passed through a stratum of gas some 3 or 4 rods wide, in which it was impossible to breathe. This, he is sure, was not smoke. Attempting with his family to pass, they were thrown down several times, and finally only escaped by crawling on the ground where the air was purer. Admitting that the air was heavily charged with gas, generated by burning vegetable matter, the question then arises whether the sudden combustion of a portion of this gas was not the cause of the tornado. That the tornado was originated by local causes is evident from the fact that a similar gale occurred at the same hour on both shores of the bay. But there was more on the bay itself. There were 2 distinct tornadoes, some 30 miles apart, and both occurring under similar circumstances, where the woods were on fire. The most plausible theory we have seen advanced as to the gases, and one which would seem to account for the fireballs and the intense heat at a distance from other combustible material, is the following, by a correspondent of the Rochester Union. Quote, "When wood burning, whether in the shape of buildings or forest trees, the flames seem to be combustion of gases distilled from the wood by the heat. The great bulk of these gases is that known as carburetted hydrogen, the same as used to light our streets and houses. If sawdust be placed in a retort, the neck of the retort drawn out to a fine tube, and heat applied, the gas which is soon given off can be lighted, and will burn like a candle until the sawdust is reduced to charcoal, when the distillation ceases. Just so in all fires. The high temperature distills the gas in great quantities. It comes in contact with the oxygen of the atmosphere, and is consumed in the shape of flame. In an ordinary fire, the air has such a free admission to the burning mass that the gas is all, or nearly all, consumed before it has a chance to escape. But where acres upon acres of forest or buildings are covered with a sea of fire, the atmosphere cannot penetrate to the center, or in other words, the oxygen of the air is consumed about the edges, or before it has penetrated very far into the interior. The result is that vast masses of carburetted hydrogen make their escape unconsumed, heated to a very high temperature, and being wafted by the winds ahead of the fire, may reach for rods before they are finally touched off by the flames. Then they flash like powder, and present precisely the appearance described by eyewitnesses of the late fires. Most persons have, while looking at a conflagration, seen flames suddenly flash in the air not directly connected with the flames below. It is simply the ignition of a mass of inflammable gas as it reaches a more abundant supply of oxygen." End quote. The same idea is also advanced in the following communication from Captain A.J. Langworthy of Milwaukee to the Milwaukee Relief Committee. Quote, "The country south of Peshtigo and on the peninsula is full of low, swampy lands, upon which the cedars grow in great abundance. At the time of the fire, these lands had become very dry through the great drought, and fires were smoldering everywhere in them. Learning that they were generally called peaty soil, I gathered some from 2 or 3 localities, and drying it, made a retort from a common clay pipe, filling the bowl and claying over the top and drying the cover, placing it in a blacksmith's forge, heating the bowl to a red heat, then touching a lighted match to the hole in the stem. A brilliant white flame was produced, which burned in the various trials from 1/2 to 3/4 of a minute. This established the fact that carburetted hydrogen gas was obtained, much purer apparently than that usually furnished by the gas works. Now these facts, taken in connection with the fact that these lowlands are invariably burned over in most cases to the depth of 2 or 3 feet, it is not unreasonable to suppose that owing to the gale which was blowing at the time, that the fire ran through these peaty soils at a great speed, eliminating this gas in greater quantities than oxygen could be supplied to consume it, and being lighter than the atmosphere, it would naturally rise, mix more or less with it, which would cause it to burn slower than if pure. Passing 1/2 mile west of Marinette, an eyewitness says it was hundreds of feet in height. Again he says that the crash and rattle was absolutely deafening, the noise not unlike that of continuous discharges of heavy artillery. These constant detonations are to be accounted for probably from the fact that these gases were separated in a measure by the atmosphere, and each explosion in its expansion would reach another body of floating gas, which would in turn perform the same office, hence the continuous roar. This is my theory, which I think will bear scientific scrutiny, if it could be restated in scientific language." End quote. From the Marinette and Peshtigo Eagle. The Peshtigo Calamity by O.K.C. Alas, what sad changes one night will bring forth. Sad, sorrowful changes. Life changed to death. Cities in ashes, towns swept out of sight. Millions on millions destroyed in one night. The 8th of October, for long years ahead, will be remembered by many that mourn for their dead. And children in pity will tell the sad tale of loved ones that perished in that fiery gale. No pen can describe, nor pencil portray, the suffering and anguish that closed that sad day. No poetic fancy or artisan skill can picture a scene that will deepen the thrill. Flee, flee for your lives, was the heartrending cry, as the hot, fiery monster came thundering nigh. Stop not for rich treasures that fade and grow old, for life is more precious than silver or gold. But the ominous warning was sounded too late. The fiery tornado for no one would wait. On rushed the red flames, like lightning they sped, and hundreds lay smothered and blackened and dead. On the banks of the river where Peshtigo stood, where thrift lent her aid and where noblest of blood proudly joined hand in hand with nature and art, where science and skill each acted their part, where logs floated down on the beautiful stream to be transformed to lumber by the power of steam. Here merchants, mechanics, and laborers all had delved day and night at prosperity's call. Here life and ambition asserted their sway. Here wealth, youth, and beauty in grandest display. The banner of progress had proudly unfurled, but its proudest achievements were swept from the world. On swept the tornado with maddening rush, uprooting the trees or the plain through the bush. And the sky-leaping flames, with hot, scorching breath, gathered parents and children to the harvest of death. How sad moans the wind o'er the desolate plain! Cold winter is coming and spreading again. Its carpet of snow on the seared, blackened earth. 'Twill rest till the spring with its new loving birth shall revive the fresh grass and bring the bright flowers with which to enliven its sweet sunny hours. While many, many in sorrow are left, of parents, of children, of loved ones bereft, whom the hours as they glide bring no joy to the soul, but o'er their sad hearts must the keen sorrows roll. We who are uninjured of our substance must give, 'tis charity's fiat, we must live and let live. As the years roll along, and the ages have sped o'er the charred, blackened bones of the Peshtigo dead, and the story is told by the pen of the age, in letters immortal on history's page, no fancy can compass the horror and fright, the anguish and woe of that terrible night. Marinette, Wisconsin, October 28, 1871. End of Chapter 7. Chapters 8 and 9 of Sketch of the Great Fires in Wisconsin by Frank Tilton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Verla Viera. Chapter 8. In the following pages we have thought it best to give the accounts of survivors, in some cases written by themselves as conveying, more graphically than any but an eyewitness could, a correct idea of the fire from various standpoints. And here we return thanks to those who have kindly assisted us by their contributions. Mr. F. Tilton. According to your request, I send you an account of my experience in the Peshtigo fire of October 8, 1871. The church-going portion of the community of Peshtigo village had just returned home from evening service when the Catholic church bell sounded the alarm of fire, no unusual occurrence that, as we had been in the habit of being drummed out to fight fire almost every alternate day for 2 or 3 weeks previous. Those of the inhabitants, however, who had property at stake, or who felt habitually nervous or apprehensive of danger, turned out and congregated on the back streets adjoining the nearest woods to the south and west of the village. Tubs and barrels of water were carried from the river and placed at the corners and convenient places. Men were stationed as thickly as possible all through the swamp, with pails of water and shovels, to extinguish any fire that might kindle from the fast-falling sparks, the underbrush being in such a dry condition as to kindle up into a large blaze immediately on being touched by any ignited substance. While watching there, I saw what I supposed to be a large meteor fall and burst a short distance from where I was standing. It afterwards proved to be a floating ball of fire, which was probably wafted by the wind from the burning woods further to the southwest. It struck on the top of a tree, and bursting, fell, and it was only with our utmost exertions that it was extinguished. Anxious to see the full force and extent of the fire, I thought I would venture a little nearer to the scene of the action. So, in company with Elder Beach, I followed a new street to the west that was just being cut through to the Oconto Road. We continued on our way for about a quarter of a mile to the end of the cut, although in imminent danger of being struck by the falling trees, some of which fell completely across the road. We could hear the roaring of the wind and fire as of a mighty storm approaching. It was now high time that we retraced our steps, but that was a matter more easily said than accomplished. The wind had begun to rise where we were, and the smoke and sand were almost suffocating. The roaring of the approaching fire was terrific, and 3 or 4 times on our return did I have to stop, and, with back to the wind, cover my face with my coat and fight hard for breath. Once, if I had not been providentially halted in that manner, I would have been struck to the ground by a falling hemlock. We now bitterly repented being so venturesome and thoughtless. There we were, hemmed in with burning woods on each side, burning woods at our backs, and a narrow opening in front filled with smoke and fire, and ourselves almost choked and blind with hot air and sand. God only knows how we ever reached the clearing unhurt. At this point, however, seemed to be only the commencement of the troubles in the village. Just as we emerged from the woods, the men, with one accord, threw away their pails and shovels and fled panic-stricken, each one to his house, some to try and save what property they could, and men of family to save those dearer to them than anything on earth. No more necessity was there for attempting to battle with the raging elements, for the air was completely filled with sparks and burning cinders, thicker than the most dense snowstorm I ever saw. Our fire engine, unfortunately, as we thought at the time, was in a different part of the village, but it would have been of no use had it been there, for, as I heard a person remark, in order to enable one company of firemen to work at all, it would require about a dozen engines to play on them to keep them from burning up. Not having any friends myself who were not able to take care of themselves, my first thought was to run to the shop and save as much of my property as I could. With the help of a friend, I succeeded in filling a large round basket with jewelry and silverware, but before many seconds had elapsed, the west end of the building had caught on fire, and we were obliged to move out as speedily as possible. The wind had shook the building so that we had hard work to open the door to make our exit. We succeeded in reaching the main street, however, but had no sooner touched the pavement than the wind carried off both of our hats, and I am certain, but for the inference of a friendly barrel of water, against which we were most unceremoniously huddled, we would have been carried off our feet into the air, basket and all. At that moment, some unfortunate person in turning the corner was struck by a flying packing box, about 4 feet square, which was hurled through the air at a tremendous speed. The poor fellow, I am afraid, never rose again. Many incidents of a like nature might be seen on our way to the river. Only a few steps, to be sure, but the amount of suffering and torture experienced in those few minutes pen could never describe. Men, women, and children, in the smoke and darkness, were shrieking and calling for help. Every few steps you might see some poor person utter a shriek and fall. Some would run a while, and then lay close to the earth to get a mouthful of fresh air, which was next to impossible to get. A middle-aged man might be seen with 2 children in his arms, and actually dragging his wife along by the clothes, she being prostrate and unable to walk. A team dashed by at a runaway speed, carrying a load of human beings to the river. In their madness, they ran upon and rode over a small child about 4 or 5 years old, who had lost his father and protector. We reached the river after a good deal of trouble, and in crossing the bridge were met by the crowds coming back, who told us the bridge was on fire on the other side. Nothing was left for us but to turn back and seek the best shelter we could on the windward side. Just as we stepped off the bridge, a gust of hot air, smoke, and sparks took me in the face and completely overpowered me. It seemed as if there was not a particle of breath left in my body, and I felt just like dropping. I had clung to my basket of goods all along, but now it had to go. Everything was thrown away that was at all cumbersome. Dr. Kelsey at that moment threw away his arms full of books. Everything was left. Nobody thought of anything but life. We plunged into the river over our heads to extinguish the fire that had started to blaze on our clothes. After wading as far as possible from the blazing buildings, I secured as sheltered a place as possible beside a large pine log and remained there up to my neck in water, not knowing if I ever would see daylight again. Taking off my wet coat, I placed it over my head in such a way as to keep my hair from burning, and also by forming an awning of it to allow me some comparatively pure air to breathe. Opening my swollen eyes for a moment, I saw with horror a young man a few feet in front of me with his hair all ablaze. He had neglected to wet his head often enough. Consequently, the cinders had lodged in his hair and started a fire. I splashed water on him, but he probably knew it about the same time I did, and instantly ducked his head. Cattle of all kinds were seen swimming around, and would approach and swim among the people as boldly as if they feared nobody or nothing. After remaining benumbed and cramped in the water for 3 hours, we concluded to venture on shore, where we built a fire and tried to keep ourselves warm in our wet clothes until morning. With our fingers, we dug some potatoes in a neighboring field, which we roasted, and ate a hearty meal therefrom. I cannot describe my feelings when daylight appeared, and I suddenly came upon the first dead body I had seen. A man burned to a crisp within 10 feet of the river's bank. Nor shall I attempt to describe the anguish and sorrow of those who had lost friends nearest and dearest to them. Fathers looking for their children, brothers looking for their sisters, wives looking for their husbands, and vice versa. Such a sight one can never forget. It was heartrending to behold. In a few hours the much-looked-for assistance was received from Marinette and the harbor, and those of the sufferers who were unable to walk were carried to a place of shelter. Yours respectfully, T.A. Hay. From the Green Bay Advocate. I am asked to give my experience in the fire, and to describe what I saw. In attempting to do so, I am more fully than ever convinced of the utter inadequacy of language to describe the scene. Those who have been in a great battle know, from experience, that the field of individual observation, as compared with the aggregate experience of the whole army, is very limited. So, in this instance, I was only one of a population of about 1,200, and I saw but little of what occurred to others. Each individual was absorbed necessarily with what to him was all important, the work of self-preservation and the preservation of his family and those near and dear to him. Everything was so different from all former experience, so sudden. The rain of fire, so terrible, so pitiless. There was nothing left for us but what seemed a blind, hopeless struggle against fate, and yet so many were saved. During the day, Sabbath, the air was filled with smoke, which grew more dense towards evening, and it was noticed that the air, which was quite chilly during the day, grew quite warm, and hot puffs were frequent in the evening. About 8:30 at night, we could see there was a heavy fire to the southwest of the town, and a dull roaring sound like that of a heavy wind came up from that quarter. At 9 the wind was blowing very fresh, and by 9:30 a perfect gale. The roar of the approaching tornado grew more terrible at 10. When the fire struck the town, it seemed to swallow up and literally drown everything. The fire came on swifter than a racehorse, and within 20 minutes of the time it struck the outskirts of the town, everything was in flames. What follows beggars all description. About the time the fire reached the Peshtigo house, I ran out at the east door, and as I stepped on the platform, the wind caught me and hurled me some distance on my head and shoulders, and blew me onto my face several times in going to the river. Then came a fierce, devouring, pitiless rain of fire and sand, so hot as to ignite everything it touched. I ran into the water, prostrated myself, and put my face in the water and threw water over my back and head. The heat was so intense that I could not keep my head out of the water but for a few seconds at a time, for the space of nearly an hour. Saw logs in the river caught fire and burned in the water. A cow came to me and rubbed her neck against me and bawled most piteously. I heard men, women, and children crying for help, but was utterly powerless to help anyone. What was my experience was the experience of others. Within 3 hours of the time the fire struck the town, the site of Peshtigo was literally a sand desert, dotted over with smoking ruins. Not a hen coop nor even a dry goods box was left. Through the sugar bush, the case seems to be even worse than in the town, as the chances for escape were much less than near the river. I estimate the loss of life to be at least 300 in the town and sugar bush. Great numbers were drowned in the river. Cattle and horses were burned in the streets. The Peshtigo Company's barn burned with over 50 horses in the stable. A great many women and children and men were burned in the streets, and at places so far from anything combustible that it would seem impossible they should burn. They were burned to a crisp. Whole families, heads of families, children, mothers, fathers, brothers and sisters, were burned, and remnants of families were running hither and thither, wildly calling and looking for their relatives after the fire. But I desist, and can only say, it was awful beyond our power to describe or anyone to imagine, and must have been seen to be understood. Respectfully, G.J. Tisdale. Mr. David Maxon, with his wife and 5 children, lived in Peshtigo village, near the woodenware factory. Mr. M. and his wife were both sick with a fever, the former just able to get around the house, and the latter confined to her bed. Seeing that the village was doomed, Mr. M. dragged his wife to the river, followed by the children, and then went back to the house and succeeded in getting a feather bed to the river. This he partly immersed in the water and got his wife upon it, and spent the night there, continually tortured by the falling coals. In the morning, Mr. Maxon made a fire to dry their clothes, and then started on foot for his farm in the sugar bush 4 miles away, to get a conveyance to take his family to his house there. Imagine his consternation on arriving at the place to find house, barn, fences, and crops all destroyed, and scarcely a landmark left to tell where the farm was. He returned sadly to his family on the bank of the river. They lost 2 houses, hay, carpenter's tools, and in fact everything. Towards evening, John Mulligan, hearing of their case, sent a team for them, and took them to a tent he had erected, and made them as comfortable as possible. In the night it rained, the water ran in under the tent, and Mr. Maxon was obliged to go out and stand bareheaded in the rain. The next day they were taken to Marinette and cared for at the hospital. He had a relapse of the fever, but happily himself and wife both recovered. Chapter 9. Mr. Newton, with his wife, wife's mother, and granddaughter, daughter of F.B. Bartels of Peshtigo, lived in the upper sugar bush. They heard the roaring of the fire for some time, and Mr. Newton, fearing that there was danger ahead, hitched up his horses and went to the house of his son Samuel, a mile away, to arouse him and his family if they should happen to be asleep. He then returned to his house. By this time the approaching fire was visible, and the roar had increased to a frightful degree. Thinking the barn a safer place than the house, the whole family went out there and entered it. The wind now came with such force that Mr. Newton had to hold the barn door with all his strength to keep it shut. He now saw sparks falling on the ground, and putting his hand on the window, found that it was hot. They then ran out of the barn. Mr. Newton went to the house to endeavor to remove some article, and his wife and granddaughter took flight across a field. The wife's mother, Mrs. Sally McPherson, remained near the barn and perished there. When Mr. Newton returned to his barn, he attempted to get a new wagon out of the shed, but the roof of the shed blew off, and he gave up the task as hopeless. He searched for the members of his family and could not find them. By this time his house and barn were on fire. He then ran down the road towards L.H. Hill's house, and found the roof of the barn blown off and the barn on fire. Mr. Hill's house was about 10 rods east of his barn, and about the same distance east of the house stood a group of 14 persons. When he reached them, not a word was said, but they were all moaning. As if by common consent, they all followed him, and they ran about 10 or 12 rods to a corner in the fence, and there wheeled around. Mr. Newton saw a gap in the woods about 50 feet wide that was not burning, and struck out for it, followed by the rest, but he stumbled and fell down, and the others probably thought he had fallen into the fire as they stopped here. But he got up again and ran on, lying down now and then to get breath. He ran a half-mile through the woods, then a half-mile across a clearing, passing another barn with the roof blown off, and then lay down in the bed of a dry creek with a young man, shielded by the bank, and was saved. A house and barn were burning on the opposite bank. Here he lay for 4 hours before he dared to venture out. On his way to the creek he had thrown off his clothing as it caught fire, until he had nothing on but pantaloons and boots. In the morning he started out to search for his family, and found that his wife and granddaughter had also taken refuge in the bed of a stream, and Mrs. Newton was still living, but the girl was dead. Mrs. Newton's burns were very severe, but she has recovered. After seeing to her safety, he went in search of his 14 companions of the night, and found them where he had left them, but 13 of them were dead. The other, a Swede named Olason, was saved by lying in a ditch, with his face close to the ground. The names of the dead here were L.H. Hill and family, L.C. Spear and family, John Olason's family, and Lucian and H. McPherson. 3 aged members of one family perished within a half-mile, as follows: Mrs. L.H. Hill, 75 years old, Asa Jackson, 82, and Sally McPherson, 84. Within a space of 30 rods east of L.H. Hill's barn lay dead 13 human beings, 23 horses belonging to R. Stevenson and Company, 15 sheep, 2 cows, 1 ox, 2 calves, and a dog. John Hoyt, who lived in the lower sugar bush, gives substantially this statement: The family consisted of mother and 3 boys, 2 grown up. They had had a neighbor to help them fight fire all day Sunday, and in the evening John took a lantern and went home with him. Returning home, he heard a roaring noise and saw the fire approaching. They immediately laid every plan for safety and carried them all out exactly. They thought that the barn would burn, but that there was a chance to save the house, and so brought up the cattle and tied them to the house, and got water ready to throw on the fire. But the tornado was more than they had anticipated. It soon became evident that the house must burn, and 2 of the brothers escaped to a marsh nearby. John and his mother then attempted to reach the marsh, which was about 30 rods distant from the house. He got a large soldier's overcoat on her, and wanted to carry her, she being feeble, but she would not consent. They had to cross a piece of new land, and the fire was blazing up from every part of it 2 to 3 feet. The heat was withering and the smoke stifling. They fell down, and the mother begged to be left there to die, and for her son to try and save himself, arguing that they could not be both saved. He told her that if she died, they would die together. He got up, got her on his back, and hastened on. The road to the marsh was between the barn and a brush heap, just wide enough to drive through, and both were burning. Beyond, a pile of brush was thrown down to make the road onto the marsh, and this was burning. But on he rushed, through and over the fire with his precious burden, tortured by the most horrible pangs, and finally fell exhausted on the marsh. Here they lay with their faces to the ground. The mother, wrapped in the overcoat, escaped burning, and asked him if he was injured, and he answered that he was so badly burned he thought he could not live more than 2 or 3 days. Here they lay on the ground until morning. Near morning they heard talking, and on calling found that the oldest and youngest brother were together and still living. They managed to get together. The youngest was very badly burned, but by careful nursing in the hospital at Marinette, all have since recovered. Early in the morning, John started out to find a place of shelter for his mother, but discovered that all their neighbors, including a married brother and his wife and child, had perished, and there were neither houses, inhabitants, or food to be found. He traveled all day and returned at 7 p.m. Monday, having had nothing to eat but a raw turnip since 4 p.m. Sunday. They did not succeed in getting their mother away until Wednesday. Terence Kelly, wife, and 4 children, lived in the upper sugar bush. When the fire came, Mr. Kelly seemed to become crazy, and seized the oldest child and ran a mile with it, and the 2 were found dead in the morning. A boy of 7 and a girl of 5 years followed them a little way, but not being able to keep up, returned, picking the fire off of each other's clothes as they ran. They were found the next morning sweetly sleeping in each other's arms besides the garden fence, unharmed, while house and barn were swept away. The mother, with the youngest child, went in another direction, and both were saved. Edward Kittner had a wagon and blacksmith shop at Peshtigo, and also owned a farm 2 miles out in the lower sugar bush. The Sunday of the fire he spent the day out there fighting fire. About 7 p.m. he went to Mr. Backman's house for a lunch, and found the family about going to bed. Warned them to sit up, as there was danger from fire. He looked out the window and saw the stumps and stubble in the clearing on fire. This was about 80 rods south of Kittner's farm. Mr. Backman hitched up his team and went to Kittner's farm. Mr. Kittner also had his own team, and from here sent his boy home to the village on foot. Mr. Backman stopped at David Heidenberg's and sent his family to the village. At Kay's farm he found his brother fighting fire and helped him. They worked half to 3/4 of an hour and saved the barn by water and sand until after the house and corn crib were burned, and then were obliged to abandon it to the same fate. They then went to the new house of Reverend Mr. Hubner, Lutheran, not yet occupied, and attempted to save the windows. Got 2 of them out when they found the house was on fire, and turning around noticed that the barn, about 5 rods from the house, was burning. They were now hemmed in by fire. The house on one side, barn on the other, a heavy log fence in front, and the woods in the rear. There was not much time for consultation, but they laid their plans, took each other by the hand, and ran through the fire. They could not see, but as it afterwards proved, they ran about 60 rods into Charles Bartell's field, and dropped down near a family burying ground, where they lay until morning. About daylight they called, to see if any living person was within hail, and were answered by Mr. Bartell's. The Kittners were both blind, and asked to be led to the village. Bartell's first led them to the creek, where they drank some water that tasted like lye, and washed themselves, after which they could see a little, and started for the village. Before reaching it, they met 2 farmers returning, who told them the village was all burned. Here was a new anxiety. What had become of the women and children? And the question was not solved until they reached the river and found them all right. Mrs. Kay's escape in the village was equally remarkable. She had the team hitched up and got her mother, her 3 children, and her sister's 3 children in the wagon, together with a trunk containing money and some other goods, and they started for the east side of the river. Mrs. Kay followed on behind, on foot, with Mr. Kay's books and a piece of new silk for a dress between them. The wagon came to grief. Another wagon came along and tore off a wheel, throwing the people and trunk on the ground. Then came another team and crushed the trunk, scattering the money and papers, and the family made a hasty and difficult escape to the bank of the river. The trunk contained $390 funds of the Oddfellows Lodge, together with books and papers, and $60 private funds of Mr. Kay, with notes, etc. A $25 note and a $60 due bill from the company were afterwards found. Mrs. Kay saved the books and silk uninjured. J.W. Philitro was business manager of a clothing store in Peshtigo village. When the fire came, he ran to the store and threw his trunk, containing clothing, books, etc., into a well, and also threw in some of the best piece goods. The well was 8 feet deep and had 10 inches of water in it. He then attempted to cover the goods with sand, but the approaching fire did not give him time. He then ran to the bridge, crossed to the east side of the river, ran up the road that led from the company's store to the woodenware factory. He was suffocated with smoke, and reaching a house, he burst open the door and rushed in. A young man was there, and he asked him for a drink and was sent to the pail. When he got his breath, he perceived that the house was burning, and persuaded the young man to try to escape. They got out the wrong door and had to climb 2 fences. The air was full of smoke and fire. He could not see, and ran wild, trying to save his whiskers and face. He finally heard someone say, "Run for the river," and started in what he judged to be the right direction. He then heard splashing in the water, ran in the direction of the noise, and got into the water, where he remained 4 hours. In the morning he discovered that the goods he had thrown into the well were destroyed. We copy below a statement of Mrs. Dix of Peshtigo village, written by herself, as conveying a very good idea of the bustle and confusion of the occasion. Quote, "When the alarm of fire was given, Mr. Dix went to fight fire. The oldest girl and I went over to one of the neighbors to see how the fire was on that side. Met Mr. and Mrs. Jacobson, and they told us they did not think there was any danger. Then we went home, and the smoke was so thick we could hardly find our way back, and the air was so hot we were glad to get into the house. I sat down and tried to read, but could not get my mind on anything. Went out again. Mr. Stewart wanted a lantern to see to fix something on top of his house. We went into the store and got the lantern. At this time we heard the roaring of the tornado, but did not know what it was, and thought, as it begun to grow lighter, that the town would burn. Went into the house and went to packing up what things were of value. It did not take long, as I had every trunk in the house packed from the fire 2 weeks before. At this time, everyone was running for the east side of the river. Mr. Dix stayed and fought fire until the last minute, and as he did not come, I thought he was burned. I was nearly distracted. He came at last, nearly out of breath, and told us to hurry and get over on the east side of the river. We took the children out of bed, half-dressed them, and the oldest girl took the 2 little boys and started for the river. I took the baby out of his crib, wrapped his cradle quilt around him, and put his cap on his head. The little girl and I started. The wind was blowing very strong at this time, and the hot sand flying so I could hardly see to walk. The baby strangled so for breath I thought I would never get to the river with him, and the wind took his cap and blanket off. We overtook the other children on the bridge. The mill and bridge were on fire at that time. We stood for a minute, and did not know which way to go. 2 young men came along and told us we had better get away from there, so we went a few steps from the bridge on some logs in the river. We had just got there when they told us to get out of that, as the fire was coming on to us. Just then Mr. Dix came over the bridge. The tornado of wind and fire came and took us off our feet. The wind took 2 of the children in between 2 warehouses. Mr. Dix lost sight of them. I told him where I thought they were, and he found them just in time to save them. At that time the whole town was on fire. We were in the river with nothing around us, Mr. Dix wetting us with his hat. He found a blanket and wet it and threw it around us. The owner wanted to take it away, but we did not give it up. We were in the river from 9:30 until 3 in the morning, when the people began to stir around and look for missing ones. They took us to a pile of coal where the company's blacksmith shop had stood, and we stayed there until daylight. We breakfasted on raw cabbage, and for dinner we had salt whitefish and potatoes roasted in the ashes." End quote. End of chapters 8 and 9. Chapters 10 and 11 of Sketch of the Great Fires in Wisconsin by Frank Tilton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Verla Viera. Chapter 10. On Thursday, September 5th, 1871, Mr. J. G. Clements of Peshtigo was married to a Miss Trudell, daughter of Theodore Trudell of Menominee. The next Sunday her mother visited her in her new home, and left on her return to Menominee at about 4 p.m. When the tornado of flame came, a few hours after, Mr. Clements and his wife started for the river. She becoming exhausted, he carried her some distance, but finally a wagon came along, and Mr. Clements persuaded the occupant to take his wife in, saying that he would do the best he could for himself. The wagon went on, and he followed behind, but soon fell in the road from suffocation and died. One of the inhabitants of Peshtigo village started for the river with his wife, but before reaching the water they both fell. He sprang up again, and seizing a woman succeeded in getting her to the water and saved her. But imagine his horror on discovering that the woman he had saved was not his own wife. It was too late to return, and his wife was lost. Mrs. Heidenworth, sick of a fever, was on a log in the river at Peshtigo village, but was thrown off by a cow swimming by. She caught the cow by the horns, and was safely carried out to the river bank. In the lower sugar bush, Mr. C. R. Towsley was found lying on the ground, a child on each side of him, the throats of all 3 cut, and a knife lying on his breast. The father had evidently, when he saw that escape was impossible, chosen to die by the knife rather than endure the horrors of torture by fire. About 10 rods from them lay Mrs. T., with an infant child on one arm and a Bible on the other, and a likeness of one of the other children on her breast. William Curtis was found dead in a well, with the bucket chain around his neck. Other instances of suicide occurred, and in still another, a young man fleeing through the burning woods in his torture stabbed himself in the breast, and attempting to repeat the blow, the knife was caught by a twig and knocked out of his hand, and his design was thus frustrated. He was saved, badly burned, and finally recovered in the Marinette Hospital. Mr. J. E. Beebe, with his wife and 4 children, lived at Peshtigo village. Mr. B. was employed as one of the accountants of the Peshtigo Company at their office. He was a fine man, warm-hearted, generous, and faithful, and with his family was respected by all. On the night of the fire, their chances of escape seemed as good as those of any, but whether they became bewildered and vacillated in determining which way to go, or whether they considered escape hopeless or stopped to search for a lost child, we cannot tell. But the father, mother, and 3 of the children fell in the road and perished there. The other, a little girl about 4 years old, straggled off towards the river and was picked up by a shoemaker, Fred Goose, taken to the river and saved. Mrs. Beebe was a daughter of Governor Baldwin of Detroit, Michigan, who afterwards came to Green Bay, sought out the little orphan, and took her home with him. He also conveyed the remains of the other members of the family to Detroit for interment. The poor but generous shoemaker was not forgotten. Governor Baldwin presented him with a purse of $500, and we learn has set him up in business at Chicago. The servant girl in the family of Mr. Shepherd at Peshtigo, when she observed the danger to the place, took all of the best clothing of the family and buried it as deep in the sand as she had time to before escaping. Mr. S. being meanwhile at the factory, endeavoring to save that. The family all escaped, supposing that they had saved nothing but the clothing they had on, which was burned full of holes, when the girl returned to the side of the house and exhumed the clothes, which were mostly uninjured. A woman in the sugar bush started with her children in a wagon for the village. On the way, she found the road blockaded by a fallen tree. She immediately cut one horse loose, got upon it with her children, and succeeded in saving them all. On the river bank, she gave birth to another child. A sadder case was that of a Norwegian woman who reached the river bank in a fearfully burned condition, succeeded in crossing the river, and there gave birth to a child and died. The sight is said to have been agonizing in the extreme. The wind during the fire was, as we have before stated, from the southwest. We have also alluded to the saving of a house in the village. The phenomenon was so curious that it deserves more than a passing notice. The house was merely a frame-up and sheathed. It took fire on the northwest side, and the boards on that side burned to a coal. The sill burned through, and yet the fire went out. On the side of the building turned towards the fire there was not a scorch. This house has since been finished up for Mr. W. A. Ellis, superintendent of the Peshtigo Company's works here. There were 4 dogs saved in Peshtigo village, and we must devote a few lines to them. One of them was a beautiful spaniel, owned by Mr. Shepherd. In the flight for safety, this dog went with the crowd to the flat below Mr. Ellis's house. John Burns, foreman at the factory, was there, bareheaded and coatless, and the dog, seeing his condition, ran off a short distance to where he had doubtless noticed a hat lying, seized the hat from the ground, and returned with it to Mr. Burns, and manifested the utmost delight when it was accepted. Mr. L. Tyler was the owner of a large Newfoundland dog named Sam. Charles Johnston owned a little rat terrier named Fritz. The dogs had been much together, and were evidently attached to each other, and the big dog did not desert his little friend in the hour of danger. Sam seized the little dog by the back of the neck, and springing into the river, took him out into the mill pond, where both dogs were saved. The Congregational Church edifice, a very good view of which we present herewith, was one of the last buildings in the village to burn, and indeed it was hoped by those who were watching the progress of the fire that it would be saved. It was a very neat and well-arranged edifice, of which the citizens were justly proud. But the fire finally struck the building and gradually crawled up towards the spire. When it was well on fire, a blast of wind blew off the spire, and it fell point downward to the ground. The point entered the ground, and the spire burned there, standing inverted by the side of the church. In the lower sugar bush, at the intersection of 3 or 4 roads, lived several families by the name of Newberry. There were Walter Newberry, wife and 5 children, Charles Newberry, wife and 2 children, Edward S. Newberry and wife, Selah F. Newberry, William Newberry, wife and 1 child, and wife's sister, and William Newberry, father of these brothers. There was also a blacksmith shop owned by Warren Church, and some other families in their residences. When the fire came, William Newberry, wife and wife's sister, and the wife of Charles Newberry, ran to a little stream about 25 feet wide and nearly dry, and sat down in the pool of water about a foot deep. About 12 feet from them, on one bank, a heavy log fence burned. At about the same distance on the other side of the stumps burned out. A few rods down the stream, a heavy log bridge was burned, and on the bank a large barn. And below them, in the stream, cattle and human beings perished. And yet there was scarcely the smell of fire about these persons, while all the fish in the pool in which they sat were killed. Not another person escaped in the whole settlement. On and near the bridge we have mentioned 18 dead bodies were found. The body of the elder Newberry has never been discovered. Chapter 11. It were well if the terrible havoc created at Peshtigo had satisfied the devourer, but it was not so. From Peshtigo northward the fire swept with unabated fury onward towards the Menominee River, about 6 miles distant. Some of the fugitives from Peshtigo attempted to escape in this direction. Heaps of wagon irons on the road tell the fate of the adventure. Between Peshtigo and Marinette and Minneconne, on the Wisconsin side of the Menominee River, and about 6 miles distant, were several buildings scattered along the road. All of these, we believe, with the exception of one of the railroad camps, were destroyed, and the fire swept onward along the road, in some places prostrating the trees, and in others merely burning the underbrush, until it reached the sand hills. These hills are mounds of sand some 40 or 50 feet in height, about halfway between Peshtigo and Menominee rivers, and here occurred one of the most remarkable incidents of the fire. The tornado seemed to divide on these sand hills, one portion sweeping toward Minneconne, and the other a little west of Marinette. The Menominee River is the dividing line between the North Peninsula of Michigan and the state of Wisconsin. On the Michigan side is the village of Menominee, and on the Wisconsin side are the villages of Minneconne and Marinette, the former being at the mouth of the river, and the latter adjoining it further up the river, the two occupying a space of about 2 miles along the bank. One branch of the tornado, as we have said, swept onward to Minneconne, and without giving the inhabitants time to save their goods, destroyed the greater part of the place. The west line of this fire swept away the planing mill of Messrs. Bagley and Curry in Marinette, the Catholic church owned by both places, and the mill of McCartney and Company in Marinette. All of Minneconne was burned with the exception of a few buildings in the outskirts. The property destroyed included the splendid new sawmill of Messrs. Spaulding, Hotelling, and Johnson, the store and hotel belonging to the company, the residence of H.P. Bird, manager of the business of this firm, and the large hotel owned and occupied by Charles Laffrey. We can probably give the best idea of the fire here by copying the entire following communication from Dr. J. Sherman, who lived at Minneconne and owned a drugstore there. Friend Tilton, in answer to your request that I would give you a description of the conflagration that destroyed Minneconne on the night of the memorable 8th of October, I have to remark that it is utterly impossible for so poor a pen as mine to do the subject anything like justice. I will attempt, however, to relate some of the principal features of the fire as I saw them, such as came under my immediate notice. A fire had been burning slowly in the woods 2 miles south of us for a number of days, 2 weeks or more. On the Sunday previous, October 1st, it had given us some alarm, and we had spent most of the day in trying to stay its progress, and had at the time quite satisfactory results. Through the first week in October, there having been no considerable wind, the fires had smoldered and burned slowly without being noticed. On Sunday again, however, the wind arose in the afternoon, and the fire brightened up sufficient to call attention again to it, and I remarked that it seemed as though we had to fight fire every Sunday. Mr. Bird and myself had been to church in the morning, and on our return he suggested that we should go out and take a look at the fire. I assented, and we rode out, as we called it, to the front. On arriving at the fire, we found that in the last week it had not burned more than 30 rods, and that not directly towards, but along on the opposite side of a road running east and west about a mile south of Minneconne, from the old Peshtigo and Marinette road to the shore of Green Bay. The remark was made that it would take a long time to get to Minneconne at that rate. Nevertheless, I remarked to Mr. Bird that it would be well enough to watch it, and it was agreed that I should remain and watch the fire until Mr. Bird could go back to the village and send someone to relieve me. After he had left, I commenced setting backfires along the road on the south side with a view of running them through to the bay shore, and so place a broad strip of burned land between us and the fire. I continued at that work until about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, when Charles Laffrey came over from the southeast, where he had been with James D. Smith and some other men engaged in the same business, and we all decided that we had got it pretty safe. Still, I thought it best to leave some 1 or 2 men to watch the fire and put out any spark that might be blown across the road. I accordingly agreed with those men to remain until I could go home and get my dinner, when I would either return or send some men to watch the fire all night. After supper, I agreed with Peter S. Downey and another man to go out to the line of the fire and remain all night, unless they were unable to keep it subdued, in which case they were to come to the village for help, but we anticipated no trouble. I went with my family to church, after which we returned home. Although the smoke was quite thick, it was no more so than it had often been in the last 4 weeks. Mr. A.C. Brown came down from Marinette to see what precautions we had taken against the fire, and I related to him what we had done, which he thought was all that was required. My family had retired, and I did the same and was soon asleep. Presently Mrs. Sherman was awakened by the wind, and asked me if I was not afraid the fire would break from the control of those men and come into the village. I, being only partly awake, told her I guessed not, and again fell asleep, but soon she aroused me again with the exclamation that the atmosphere felt hot and oppressive, and that she was going to get up, and in doing so fully aroused me, and I got up too. After taking a look around, we decided to remain up, and proceeded to dress ourselves, she remarking that she was afraid that the town would all burn up, and that if she only saved 1 suit of clothes, she would save as good as she had. I took another view of the case, i.e., that I should have to fight fire dressed accordingly, putting on over all a heavy woolen shirt. In a short time a bright illumination sprang up in the southwest, the wind increased to a gale, sparks began to fall in the streets, and we could see the fire approaching with the speed of a racehorse. In a short time Mr. August Lindquist's dwelling was on fire. I then made up my mind that our buildings must go, and went into the house to call up the rest of the family, consisting of our 3 children and hired girl, none of whom were yet awake. I went down to my barn as soon as my stableman was up, to have my horses harnessed and put to the wagon. While he was putting the harness on the horses, I turned out the balance of my stock, consisting of another horse, a cow, and 11 hogs, some white chesters that I had been raising to improve the stock of swine in the vicinity. By the time I had them turned out, my man had the horses harnessed, and brought them out to the wagon, which my wife and the other men had filled with various notions, including the trunks of clothing they were trying to save. I looked around and saw that the fire was spreading. Other houses were on fire, one belonging to Mr. Briggs, near the one that took fire first. Also a new building of Mr. Archibald's, that was not yet finished, situated 40 or 50 rods from the first 2, and I decided that the whole south point would burn over, and that if I kept the horses trammeled with harness and wagon, they would burn too. So I stripped the harness off and let them go, having first locked the barn so that they could not get back in there and burn up. We put what we could on my wagon, and drew it away by hand. Also my buggy, into which I had put my medical library, and a buckboard wagon in my charge belonging to a Mr. Stearns of Peshtigo. In the meantime, our hired girl, with our oldest daughter, aged 12 years, and youngest, aged 2, came down and asked me where they should go. I said, out on the bridge, that I would be there in a few minutes and take care of them. Our boy, aged 9 years, concluded to stay with his mother and help her. The girls went out on the bridge and concluded to go on across the river to my brother's in Menominee, Michigan, and the inhabitants of the village, 200 or 300 of them, mostly women and children, were trying to make their escape in the same way. Arriving, as they told me, at the ferry, a few only were able to cross, and the balance took possession of the Philbrook brothers' dismantled schooner, which was lying at the ferry dock at the time, being refitted, but at this time consisted of a hull and lower masts, and pushing out into the stream. The wind, which was a tornado at this time, blew them directly towards the Michigan shore until they struck the bar in the middle of the river, where they grounded and remained all night. By this time, all my buildings on the main land were on fire. The dwelling houses on the front street, the bridge across the Wisconsin channel of the river, the entire island, including the dwellings of the two Philbrick brothers, their shop, stables, and shipyard, my warehouse and docks, from which they had just taken the vested, which was now aground. The balance of my family had retreated from the fire towards the east end of the South Point, and one of the boys, Charles Johnson, had got a team, and having hitched the 3 wagons together, we towed them all to the South Point, where, as the result proved, they were out of danger. Mike Curry, the efficient foreman of Spaulding, Hotelling, and Johnson, had up to this time been trying, with all the men he could raise, to check the progress of the fire on the south of the village, and thus save the company's barn, boarding-house, store, and mill, but they were forced to leave. Other of Mr. Curry's people had taken their most valuable goods and furniture into the fireproof boiler-house of the new mill, which was situated on an island surrounded by a sheet of water 600 feet wide, and considered safe. The fire came on in the rear, first attacked the company's large barn, then the barns and stables of the Exchange Hotel, Mr. Curry's dwelling-house, the company's boarding-house, then their store, smith shop, carpenter shop, and 1 or 2 small dwellings in the rear, and then all at once the whole inside of the mill was illuminated. The flames burst the slates from the roof, and the whole magnificent structure was a mass of fire. The solid 2-feet walls of brick composing the end of the boiler-house next the mill, with its double iron doors, was no barrier to the destroying element. The roof, composed of iron framework, covered with heavy slates, melted away as though it were composed of paper, and the Mennicani mill, which had so recently cost over $100,000, was reckoned among the things that were. Even the Michigan channel of the river, near half a mile wide, was no barrier to the flames. The Gilmore mill on the North Point was soon in flames, and it, with the dwellings and other buildings around it, were reduced to ashes. On the South Point were several hundred persons, hemmed in by the fire on the south and west. On the north side was the river, with no way of crossing, and on the east the bay. My mind had been taken up with the work and scenes around me, but now I began to think of my children. Where were they? Had they crossed the river before the fire reached them, or had they crossed that other river? And, oh God, how no one could tell! I could not rest. I essayed to go up around by Marinette, but the fire was still too hot. I came back and paced up and down for an hour or more, and tried again, but was still unable to pass the barrier of fire. Soon I made a 3rd trial, and succeeded in passing, but as I passed up the front, or river road, nothing met my gaze but one blackened mass of ruins. By some means the company's farmhouse had escaped, and a small house on the opposite side of the road, but the Pioneer Manufacturing Establishment, owned by Messrs. Bagley and Curry, and only recently completed at a cost of nearly $20,000, with its machinery and piles of dry seasoned clear lumber, the result of years of hard labor by 2 enterprising men, laid low in the dust, with 2 dwelling houses near it. McCartney's mill and buildings connected with it were in ashes, but the Union Schoolhouse, although its outhouses and fences, and even the grove in which it stood, were burned to ashes, stood there on its hill, alone in its glory. The Catholic church and priest's house were burned. The next, a dwelling, was saved, but the next 2 dwellings, Mrs. Kerrigan's and a house built by Martin Blood, were burned, and there the fire stayed its progress. I passed on up to Marinette, where I was met by Leonard Gould, who, while yet at a considerable distance, hallooed and asked me if I knew where my children were. I answered no, but was going to see. "Well," he said, "I do, and they are safe. They are on Philbrick's vessel in the middle of the river, and you want to go right back and let them know where you are, for they think you are burned." I broke right down. Thank God, my family was all safe, and I was happy if my house and stores and other property were all burned. It mattered not. I could work for more. In conclusion of this somewhat wordy description of the Mennicani fire, permit me to say that I never saw the like before, and I hope I may never witness the like again. The fire consumed 35 dwellings, 3 stores, 2 sawmills, 1 planing mill, sash, door, and blind factory, 2 hotels, 10 barns, several cows, some pigs and other animals, but no human lives were lost. J. J. Sherman. End of chapters 10 and 11. Chapters 12 and 13 of Sketch of the Great Fires in Wisconsin by Frank Tilton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Verla Viera. Chapter 12. We have in the previous chapter given an account of the destruction of Menaconi and the lower portion of Marinette. We have stated that the fire, which separated at the sand hills and swept onward towards the Menominee in two lines, destroyed Menaconi. At Menaconi, the fire jumped the river, over 1,000 feet wide at that place, and burned a mill at Menominee, of which mention will be made hereafter. From the burning buildings in Menaconi and the mill in Menominee, the fire swept out over Green Bay to an incredible distance, endangering the shipping on the bay. The schooner C.I. Hutchinson, lying at anchor off Ingleston, and 2 miles from the fire, was threatened by the burning coals, and her deck was covered with cinders. Her rigging, and that of several other vessels, caught fire. A piece of shingle 4 or 5 inches square, partially burned, fell on the deck of the schooner Atlanta, 7 miles out on the bay. The other branch of the fire swept on towards Marinette, threatening the entire destruction of the place, but fortunately the heaviest of the wind barely touched the village on its western edge, burning some unimportant buildings. Thus it will be seen that the village of Marinette lay on the piece of ground between the two branches of the tornado, and this fact, together with the fact that the citizens put forth almost superhuman efforts in fighting the fire, saved the main portion of the place from destruction. It is universally conceded that had Marinette burned, there could have been no possible salvation for the village of Menominee. We copy below an account of the fire at Marinette, written by request for this work by Mr. A. M. Fairchild of that place. From sunset, our town had been wrapped in a cloud of smoke so dense that it was with difficulty one could get breath. Cinders and partly burned leaves were falling thick and fast all over town, and the atmosphere was oppressively warm. Yet but few apprehended the dangers so nearly upon us. People attended church as usual upon Sabbath evening, and the usual number of loungers were about the public houses and corners, conversing upon other subjects than fires and tornadoes. But at about 9 o'clock a strange sound burst upon our ears, coming from the southwest, a sound similar to that caused by the falling of some mighty water, or the roar of ocean waves dashing up against a rocky shore, or the rumbling noise of a train of cars coming at a distance. At first it seemed a great way off, but gradually grew nearer and nearer, until, as if by magic, a sea of flame rolled in upon us, and mountains of fire rose up all around us. Rushing furiously forward, the flames would leap high in air, then dive to earth again, seemingly meaning to leave nothing unscorched or living, seeming to dare all humankind, and laugh to nothingness all efforts to subdue, here and there bursting forth, and spreading as fast as I could discern, until it seemed that the whole heavens were on fire, and the earth to be but a vast pit of fire wherein all must perish. How frightful, yet how grand, how indescribably grand was the sight! Strong men trembled, and stout hearts grew faint at first, but seeing that it must be either a fight for life and property, or a flight and leave all, took courage again, and rallied to the call for help and more men, and nobly did they fight the fire fiend until he was subdued. To the reader, we must say that this was no common fire. Fanned as it was by a terrible tornado, it would travel at almost lightning speed. Like the scythed chariots of old, mowing to the ground all before them, so too did that whirlwind leave nothing standing in its course. Thus, in my feeble way, I have described the appearance and sound of that great tornado of fire that visited our town on that never-to-be-forgotten night of the 8th of October, 1871. Now, in brief, I shall give a history of the conflict, and mention the names of a few persons who are deserving of much praise for their efforts made to subdue the flames. At the commencement of the fire, Mr. Isaac Stevenson, with his characteristic forethought and wisdom, seeing that the town must surely burn if every effort possible was not made to subdue the flames, dispatched a messenger from his house to Messrs. Brown, Merriman, and Kearney, requesting them to send every available man and team to fight fire. He also sent a similar request to his brothers Samuel and Robert on the Menominee side of the river. When the fire approached Mr. Stevenson's house, he, knowing that by saving it he held the key to the west end of the town, coolly gave orders to the men that had come to his assistance, then, leading the way, fought like a soldier until the flames were entirely subdued. I must also speak of Mr. A. C. Brown, part owner and superintendent of the N. Luddington Company mill. At the beginning of the fire, he, seeing that there was a general lacking in the field, at once saddled and mounted his horse, and disposed of the different forces with such wisdom and celerity that much was done towards subduing the flames before they had made much headway among the buildings. He was riding to and fro the whole night from point to point, ordering men and teams, hauling water to points in most danger, cheering men on to their work, and doing all that man could do to save the town, and his efforts were crowned with glorious results. Like a general in the field, Mr. Brown's voice could be heard loud above the road of the fiery tempest, telling men what to do and how to do it. I will also speak of a few, out of many others, who are deserving of much praise for the noble work they did, among whom were Messrs. Merriman, Eli Wright, John Holgate, Cable Williams, Leonard Gould, Calvin Hatch, Henry Bentley, D.C. Prescott, and I might say the whole mill crews of Messrs. Merriman, Brown, and Kearney. The number of buildings destroyed in Marinette were 14, among which were the sash, door, and blind factory of Bagley and Curry, McCartney's mill and boarding house, Catholic church, and priest's house. An approximate cost of property destroyed is about $150,000. During the fire at Marinette, it seemed impossible at first to save the place. There was a general stampede of the citizens seeking safety. A large number of the women and children, estimated at 300, went on board the steamer Union, Captain Thomas Hawley, lying at her dock. The officers and crew of the boat lost no time in getting up steam, and she swung out into the river with her precious freight and drifted down with the tide, the engines being used only to keep her from grounding on the Menominee bank of the channel with the force of the gale. That was indeed a hazardous trip. The channel was so narrow and crooked, and the smoke so thick, that the captain dare not steam down the river, knowing that if she grounded opposite the burning town, she must be destroyed with all her precious freight. But on she went, slowly, through the withering heat, on between the two fires in Menaconi and Menominee, and succeeded in reaching a place of safety below the fire. The passage of the Union gunboats past the batteries of Vicksburg was not more hazardous. The Menominee River, near the mouth, is, we believe, considerably over 1,000 feet in width, and the flames rolled across in great sheets from the burning mill of Spaulding, Hotelling, and Johnson, and quickly caught and lapped up the mill of R. Stevenson and Company, known as the Gilmore Mill, with the few surrounding buildings. Happily, however, the wind was fair to take the fire from here out over the water. Further up the river another wave of fire crossed, leaping over the buildings on the river bank in Menominee, and setting fire to the sawdust beyond. This fire ran along the ground nearly across the place, but by prompt attention was extinguished without doing any damage. The fire also caught several times on the river bank. At the upper end of Marinette, the large dam of the Menominee River Navigation Company took fire and burned to the water's edge. The fire crossed the river and swept with resistless fury through the timber. It extended, we believe, some 20 miles up the Menominee River, doing immense damage to the timber. The mill of T. Cole and Company, 5 miles north of Menominee, was burned, and many buildings shared a similar fate. In the township of Menominee, so far as known, 27 persons perished. This includes the Birch Creek settlement. The fires, throughout their whole extent, presented the same phenomena of intense heat. At the mill of T. Cole and Company, the woods were 40 to 50 rods distant, yet so great was the heat that glass melted on the open ground. The mill, 3 houses, a barn, and 70,000 feet of lumber were burned here, and the people saved themselves in a pond. Chapter 13. Birch Creek was a small farming settlement, about 12 miles from Menominee River, on the state road to Escanaba, and contained about 100 inhabitants. The destruction of this settlement was total, and 19 persons, including 2 travelers, were burned to death. We cannot, perhaps, give any other description of the fire here that will possess the interest of that contained in a letter from Phineas Eames, one of the survivors, and which was printed in the Religio-Philosophical Journal of Chicago of December 9th. It is a singular story, and of course we cannot vouch for the exactness of that portion of the statement referring to supernatural visitations. We only know that Mr. Eames lived at Birch Creek, that he lost the members of his family that he says he did, that those to whom he refers corroborate his statement as to freedom from pain, and that those who know him give him a good character for veracity and morality. We are indebted for this article to Honorable Lyman C. Draper, Secretary of the Wisconsin State Historical Society. Tried in the fire and found true. Dear Brother, here I am at home with the remnant of my family, the 2 oldest girls, in answer to your kind letter telling me to come with my 2 motherless children. God and his angels be with you to reward you and yours for the kind welcome extended to us on our arrival. We reached your home on the morning of the 8th, leaving Menominee Tuesday evening, the 7th ultimate. I desire to give you some account of this terrible fire, which we have passed through. Leaving my wife, your Mary's sister, and our 2 young children, ages one 13 months and the other 7 years, behind us, gone on before us to the other shore, and why we were spared, and I in particular, burned as I am, is more than I can tell, but God knows. Oh, the horrors of that night no pen can portray or language express, and we who suffered can hardly realize what we have passed through. Sunday, October 8th, was a cold, chilly day. The atmosphere was very remarkable, still, and filled with a dense, blinding smoke, fearfully increasing towards night. Still, we felt no real alarm, as I was confident that if the woods were on fire and the fire approaching, I could save my family and my buildings, as we had prepared for such fires, and were in a clearing of 12 acres. Through the day I had been out in all directions, looking for fire or any signs of actual fire approaching, but there was none. Therefore, on my return home towards night, I felt no more alarmed than usual, and yet could not rest on account of the dense smoke and peculiar smell accompanying, making it very unpleasant to inhale. However, my wife and children went to bed as usual. I laid down on a lounge and was up and down through the night, watching, as had been my custom since any talk of fires. At 9:45 in the evening, I was up and out in the darkness. Nothing was to be seen or heard, hardly a leaf stirring, but oh, the smoke! The smell, one could hardly endure it. I feared I knew not what. I laid down until the clock struck 11, when I was aroused by seeing lights approaching our house. I woke up wife and children, and told them to dress themselves, and then went out to see who was coming. It proved to be my next neighbor, Mr. Blovet and family, coming over, so that we might be together in case of fire, as there was more clearing around my house than theirs. By the time they had got to our house, my family were up and waiting, feeling the approach of some unseen foe. We knew not from whence or where to look for danger, and yet felt this ominous stillness, this dense smoke and stench, together with the cold and intense darkness, all combined, portended something fearful, and we waited in silence its approach, Mr. B. and myself outside, our families inside. I had closed the doors to keep out the cold and smoke. While standing a few feet from the door, all at once I saw a bright light approaching, in size large as a half-bushel measure, and as it came toward us, it appeared like a ball of fire, approaching from the southeast, and I saw it pass directly over my house to the northwest, just high enough to clear the house. The night being so very dark, as it passed over, it dazzled our eyes, and I watched it out of sight. All in the house saw the same light, as it approached and disappeared from the windows. Next we heard a tremendous explosion, which was so great that I can compare the sound to nothing I ever heard. The ground shook and trembled beneath our feet. The house jarred to its foundation, and the window glass rattled in their place, and while we stood in breathless silence, not knowing which way to look or turn, or from what quarter the danger was coming, for as yet we saw no fire approaching, we heard a low, rumbling sound, a sullen roar, like an earthquake. This lasted only a few moments, after which came a change of atmosphere with slight puffs of wind, and growing warmer every moment. Suddenly my house took fire overhead. Remember, I was outdoors in the midst of this intense darkness, and as I looked, my large barn was also on fire, the fire crawling along like a snake, a rising flame of fire on top of the barn, on top of the house, in the tops of the trees, in the air, and yet no fire on the ground. I opened the door and came out, and we all started for the hill. You remember the ridge west of my house. We had selected this place to go to in case of fire, and from this fire we knew no better place to go. House and barn on fire. We must go somewhere. All this took but a moment, and we left the house, our happy home, forever, only to be united again beyond the river of death. Mr. B and family, together with my children, proceeded ahead. At this time all was instantaneously light as day, darkness had disappeared, and the whole heavens seemed one vast wave of fire. I took baby out of my wife's arms, and we followed the others towards the hill. Oh God, such a scene as now presented itself cannot be described. Not only in an instant had my house and barn taken fire on their roofs, but the whole air was one bright wave of flame fire, and as yet no fire on the ground, only later, as it caught from this shower of fire in the air. We hastened on. When about 60 feet from the house, wife spoke. "Pa, Lincoln is in the house, our only son." I placed baby in her arms, saying, "You follow the rest to the hill while I run back and see, and if he is there, I will bring him to you, dead or alive." I entered the burning house, which was all in a blaze overhead, and fire falling through in every direction, so rapid had been its progress. My search was sharp and rapid, but he was not there. I ran back to where I had left my wife, supposing she had gone on, when to my surprise I found her standing just as I had left her. I said to her, "He is not in the house. Give me the baby. He must have gone on with the rest." I took baby on my left arm, and just then saw our boy coming towards us. He came running up to me, saying, "Papa, I shall be burned up. What shall I do?" I replied, saying, "Give me your hand, my boy, and we will go to the top of the hill, but don't try to get away from Papa." I saw that his terror was very great. I feared for him. I also said, "See, Pa has got baby and mother here, and we will go together." Thus, having him by one hand and baby on the other arm, I said to wife, "Take hold of my vest collar," as I had no coat on. She did so, but never spoke from the time she thought our boy was in the house. She was perfectly paralyzed with fear for his safety, and stood gazing at the terrible fire in the heavens. I noticed as we hurried along that the wind was increasing at a fearful rate, great trees bending like withes before it. A few steps more, and we would have reached the top of the hill where the children and Mr. B and family were. At this point, my son let go of my hand and bounded away like a deer towards his sisters, and at the same instant there came upon us, from what quarter I know not, a wave of living fire, completely enveloping us in its embrace, and prostrating us all to the ground. It struck me in the face, blinding me in an instant, and my long beard and hair were in a blaze. I fell forward, with my baby in my arms, all on fire, wife falling across my feet and rolling over on her back, not a sound from her or baby, myself in flames. The roar of the fire tornado was more than deafening. It was grand. It was like the sound of the cataract, the thunder, and the roar of the sea combined. It was fearfully sublime. I laid my baby down, drew up my feet from beneath my wife, and in the midst of this fearful ruin prayed Almighty God to let me die with my family. Why had he passed me by? "Oh, take me too," I cried. I had no desire to live, for I supposed that all was gone, and that the sheet of flame had swallowed all, and in agony of spirit I prayed to go too. But I was not allowed to die. A voice came to me, so distinct and clear. I heard it, I am not mistaken, saying, Get up and look for your children." I could not resist. I rose to my feet, went forward a few steps, and there at my feet lay a little form, roasted to a crisp. I supposed it was my darling boy. "Oh, my brother!" I cried aloud. My senses were suspended for a moment. I knew nothing. I groped my way along. I knew not where. I thought I saw some object moving. I pulled my eyes open, called my eldest girl. Brave child, she came to me into the very face of death. She came into the fire, saying, "Oh, where are mother and baby?" I replied, "Mother and baby are dead," "And where," I asked, "are Mary and Lincoln?" She answered, "Mary is here with me. Lincoln is dead." I was blind and on fire. She led me where Mrs. B.'s children and Mary were. Mr. B. and part of his family were gone, we knew not where. I said to them, "We must all lay on our faces that we may breathe, the air being full of fire falling all around us." The wind had increased to a hurricane, the largest trees bending and being uprooted before it. The roar of the wind, the blazing and falling timber, the glare of the fire, the whole heavens being one vast sheet of flame. One must see to fully know and understand the horrors of that terrible night. There is no use for me to attempt to describe it. It cannot be done. There is no danger of any pen or speech exaggerating the scenes of this fearful hour, for all of this happened in less time than I could tell it. In less than 1 hour, wife and children burned up at my side, my property all destroyed, and the ashes of my home left, and this was the foe that had come upon us. No one could guard against fire from over our heads, and we fell before it. Can you imagine my feelings, brother, as with my girls, now motherless, myself still burning, we lay there? God grant you may never pass through such a night. Now the wind decreased in violence, and the force of the tempest of fire and wind had passed on. We could yet hear its terrible roar, and were in its awful trail. We now began to fully realize our condition. All of us cold, nearly naked, I fearfully burned from the top of my head down to the soles of my feet, suffering the most intense pain. I felt that I could not endure and live. My face one mass of burns, my hands fairly roasted, body burned deep in many places, legs and feet fairly roasted. I had on 2 pairs of pants. They were tucked inside my boots. They were burned clear off and up inside the boots, leaving the leather burned to a crisp on my roasted feet. Can you realize what I passed through and suffered, suffering 10,000 deaths, and could not die, as I had desired to, with wife and babies? I then called on the little group, 6 of us in all, and said to them, "Here is all there is left of our 2 families, so far as we know. We know not where your husband and the other children are. My wife, baby, and son are dead. Now, in this hour of sorrow, let us all, with one accord and united voices, pray earnestly to Almighty God, our Father, as we never did before, that we may have grace and strength to endure this terrible affliction that has come upon us, that in the fearful pain I was suffering, I might be sustained and strengthened." And as our voices mingled, ascending in prayer, all at once I felt surrounded with a host of angelic beings. They were on my right and on my left, before me and behind me. I felt their presence so clearly that I thought if I moved either way I should touch them. And we prayed on without ceasing, until in a moment my pain left me entirely, and from that moment I have never felt the least pain from my burns, and all who were with me and have nursed me for the last 30 days can testify to my condition when with them. And I call upon my God to witness that this is the truth, and that I am this day a living demonstration of his power to heal through ministering spirits. Although, brother, you know I have never professed to be a spiritualist, neither have I been a member of the church for many years. I know not who these beings were. I recognized none of them. It mattered little to me who they were. When they came, my pain left me, and more, they lifted from me the great weight of sorrow that weighed down my soul. They bid me look up, not down on those lifeless forms. They were not there, in those charred and marred bodies. They have passed on, are now resting in the summer land above, and will be with you soon. They suffered not as you think, but in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the sound of the tornado's trumpet, they were born into the immortal life. Turn now to the living. There is your duty. Mourn not for those who have passed on. You are to live and go on from here. From this united prayer I rose up, free from pain, and strengthened to endure my loss. We remained there until near daylight. Beginning to feel cold, I was led to some half-burned logs, which they turned over, and we sat between them trying to keep warm, as there was not fire enough left to keep us warm. It had come upon us like a flash of lightning, and left us as quickly, with our dead and the ashes of our homes as tokens of its visitation. Morning light came. I wished once more to look, with my motherless girls, upon our lost and loved ones. My 2 girls led me back to where their mother and baby sister lay. I pulled my eyelids apart, for my face was so swollen and blistered I could not see only as I opened my eyes by force and looked upon their faces for the last time on earth. Somehow their faces were not much burned, but I cannot dwell here. They were dead, their bodies roasted. My wife lay as she fell, with arms extended towards heaven, as if imploring aid. A little further on we found our darling boy, the one on whom I had hoped to lean for support in my old age. Not burned as the others, but we supposed died from inhaling the hot air. We turned from our dead in silence, passed on by the ashes of our home, no longer a home to us. All had gone. I turned with my children and started for Menominee, 7 miles away, not thinking for a moment that all between our little settlement and the town had shared our fate. But soon we found that such had been the force of the tempest that the state road was blockaded. Huge trees, torn from their roots, lay across the way in every direction, making the road almost impassable. Fire had passed over the ground, leaving its traces all around. Every house was burned between ours and the town but one, and this was 5 miles away. We reached it about 7 o'clock in the morning. All that day I was led by my girls and our neighbors, over and under trees, groping along in the darkness, for I was blind. All of us hungry, thirsty, and nearly naked. Glad were we when we reached Judge Ingall's farm. We found an old Frenchman in charge, who welcomed us and supplied our pressing wants. Just then Dr. Sherman met us, having come down quickly as possible after getting word from my neighbor who had gone ahead. The doctor, seeing how bad I was, and I being so tired, thought best to have me rest until morning, when they would send the teams again for me. Tuesday morning came, and I was carried on a bed on a wagon to Menominee, 2 miles, and found friends who kindly welcomed me and dressed my wounds. Remaining with them for 30 days, until able to come to your house with my motherless girls, where I was welcomed by your family. God bless you, my brother. I have told you I got to Menominee Tuesday morning, October 10th, and while there was cared for by Dr. Sherman, who, after cutting off the rags, remnants of my clothes, proceeded to dress my burns, roasted feet and hands, and swollen eyes. I cannot tell you how bad I was. You know Dr. Sherman well, and to any who doubt my word, write to him as to my condition, and then they will realize fully what the Lord has done for me through his angels. Dr. Shepard and Dodge took charge of me after the first few days. I was tenderly cared for and nursed with brotherly and sisterly love from all with whom I met, having experienced nothing but kindness to myself and children. Friends of long standing and strangers vied with each other in acts of kindness to us in our helpless condition, and have our grateful thanks. Dr. Sherman, Shepard, Dodge, Judge Ingalls, Messrs. Quimby, Abbott, Brooks, Bagley, and others will testify that when I reached Menominee, my condition was such none thought I would live, and all who came in contact with me will testify to the truth of my statements that I have suffered no pain, and they have heard no complaints or groans or flinching when my burns were being dressed. On Tuesday night, the 16th, while lying at the Taylor house, I saw my wife in a vision. Others came with her, and it was said to me from these spirits, I could not distinguish whose voice, "You will live, and go to Illinois." I awoke and felt refreshed, and have ever since felt surrounded by these unseen friends, helping me all the time. I could not at the time comprehend how I was to go to Illinois in my present condition. You may judge of our surprise on the receipt of your and Mary's letter to Judge Ingalls and myself, with love, sympathy, and your home open to us. Brother and sister, it quite overcame me, and yet I felt and knew I was to go to your home with my girls, expecting to have to ask you for a home through the winter, and instead came the invitation, a free will offering from you and yours. So at the end of 30 days, the promise of those heavenly visitors was fulfilled. I left. Kind friends procured me a pass to Chicago. They saw me on board the steamer for Green Bay, where other kind friends, strangers to me, many of them friends of yours, saw me on board the cars, went with me to the mayor's office, who kindly greeted us, then countersigned our pass and bid us Godspeed. Who could do more? All the way to Chicago, conductors and all others on board of the cars seemingly vied with each other to help us on our way. It was only necessary for me to mention the Peshtigo and Menominee fires and point to my burns, for they were my witnesses. On my way I met many who knew you, and to mention your name to them was to win at once their sympathy and help. One gentleman came to me, inquired about the fire, our condition, where we were going, etc., and took a fine woolen scarf from his neck, asking me to accept it, saying, "Tell E.V. Wilson, his old friend, Mr. Harding of Shell Rock, Iowa, gave it to you." He then hurriedly left. And now, my brother, here I am, in your home, all there is left of my once happy family, being tenderly cared for, all our wants supplied by your Mary and children, and after 5 weeks, I find myself quite helpless. I can see, thank God. My hands and feet are slowly improving, and I am gaining strength and can move about the house a little. I feel confident that I will regain the use of my hands in time. The nails are all coming off, but new ones will come in their places. I trust to retain all my fingers and the use of them. I thank God for allowing us to testify that I have been healed of pain through the ministrations of angel friends, and I here desire to add my testimony to the thousands of other witnesses, that I know our loved ones do return to us, and that men and women are prompted by these, our spirit friends, and theirs also, to help their brothers and sisters of this earth life. And now, dear brother, this is the way I have been led to your house, and made welcome by your family, as well as by many unseen angel friends. I can feel their presence, but cannot always see them, and since being in your home, have felt them working over my crippled hands and feet, and believe they will restore me the use of them in good time. And now, brother, I am a living demonstration of spirit power through the laws of God, who came to my help in my hour of trial, and relieved me of all my pain. I am now a spiritualist. What else could I be after seeing, hearing, and feeling their presence, and witnessing their power to remove pain and restore one back to life who was so near the grave as I was? And you are at liberty to make use of these facts as it seems good to you. All I have here stated can be proved by writing to any of the parties mentioned above, or to the Relief Committee at Menominee, Michigan. They will all remember me as the only one so badly burned that lived. God and angels be with you, my brother, and bless you in your work in the cause of spiritual freedom. And here let me thank all kinds of friends who have assisted me and mine through you. I could add much more in detail, but have dictated enough to give you some idea of what I and mine have passed through, and of the manner my dear wife and children closed up their earth life, and were born into spirit life through fire. I hope soon to see you, and look forward to the new year, anticipating your return, for Mary says you will spend New Year's Day with the dear ones at home. Mary, your mate in life and partner in business, writes this for me, as I cannot. My girls send love to Uncle Eben, whom they have not seen for over 6 years. Accept love and heartfelt thanks from myself and children. Your brother, Phineas Eames. End of chapters 12 and 13. Chapters 14 and 15 of Sketch of the Great Fires in Wisconsin by Frank Tilton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Verla Viera. Chapter 14. Before the great conflagration on the west shore of the bay, a large number of houses were destroyed, and scarce a settlement had altogether escaped. On the Oconto River, many buildings were burned. Some were burned on the lower Pensacola, and a considerable settlement in the town of Pensacola, lying between that river and the Oconto, was almost completely swept away. Mr. George W. Delano gives us the following list of the most important losses in the town of Pensacola. Peter Leon lost his wife and nearly lost his own life. His house was burned. George Ross, house and barn. J. Judd, house. J. McDermott, house. R. L. Rice, house and barn. Peter Christian, blacksmith shop. James C. Bundy, house. O. W. Farley, 2 large barns. Edgar Donano, house and stable. A. Eldred, 2 barns and house. John Matroves, barn. Besides these, all the lumbering camps in the town were burned, and there were many minor losses. The whole population were exhausted with the continual fight they were obliged to wage against the fire demon. Sometimes the fire would be accompanied by a gale almost equaling a tornado, against which the fight seemed almost hopeless. On one occasion, Mr. George Hart of Oconto attempted to drive through from Oconto to Green Bay with a team of horses, but a few miles south of Pensacola he found the roads impassable, owing to the fire and smoke, and attempted to return. Meantime, a burning tree had fallen across the road. The horses dashed through the fire, breaking loose from the carriage, and throwing Mr. Hart into the fire. He maintained his hold on the lines, and was dragged some distance along the road, where he was found shortly afterwards in a fearfully burned condition, but has since recovered. Other incidents of like hairbreadth escapes might be enumerated. It is utterly impossible to state with any degree of certainty the loss of life on the west shore of Green Bay. Particularly is this the case at Peshtigo village, where there were a large number of single men and persons continually going and coming. It is known that the village was unusually full of strangers on the night of the fire, and many are unaccounted for. And we hear frequent inquiries from abroad for persons who were supposed to be in that vicinity. There is good reason to believe that many of these inquiries will never be answered. Many were lost who might have been saved had they not got the impression that this was the final end of all things, and there was no use in attempting to escape from certain doom. Surely all the conditions described in the inspired prophecy of the end of the world seem to be met by the roar of the tornado and the blazing heavens and earth. The number of the dead at Peshtigo is variously estimated at 500 to 800. In the lower sugar bush, 20 families were entirely exterminated, and many others were nearly all lost. We copy below a list of 315 of the dead. Upper Sugar Bush. L. H. Hill and wife, Augusta Brackett, John Jackson, James Law, L. H. McPherson, Miss E. Newton, age 9 years, R. Newton, 5 years, George Pennery, Alfred Pennery, Joseph Pennery, Charles Pennery and wife, Terence Kelly and daughter, Fred Seymour, Mrs. Charlotte Seymour, Charles Bush, wife and 6 children, John Taylor and 2 children, Patrick Doyle, wife and 7 children, Harry Jackson, 2 years, Blank Boamaster, wife and child, William Pape, Mrs. Olive Bosworth, A. Jackson, Sally McPherson, P. Weinhardt, wife and 5 children, William Duquette, Benjamin Duquette and wife, Mrs. John Utter and 2 children, Miss Augusta Bartels, Ellie Spear, wife and 2 children, James Hayes, John Loyal, Fred Caro, wife and 1 child, also the father-in-law and mother of the party last named, Nellie Olison, Miss Casta Olison, and Mrs. Anna Olison. 73. Middle Sugar Bush. Pratt, wife and 2 children, William Aldress, wife and 2 children, Mrs. Joseph Leisure and 5 children, William Curtis and child, burned in well, Mrs. William Amer, Joseph Lefebvre, wife and 4 children, Mrs. Martin Fagan and 2 children, Hesley and Mary Fletcher, Henry Hayes Sr. and wife, Mrs. William Pennery and child, Charles Chapman, wife and 1 child, not found, Norwegian John, Miss Berner, Mrs. William Bell, Lindsay Laux and wife, Miss Bell Glass, Willie Glass. 42. Lower Sugar Bush. Charles Helms, died at Dunlap House, Charles Helms, Jr., Mrs. Charles Helms, Sr., Charles Newberry and 2 children, Edward S. Newberry and wife, S. F. Newberry, Walter Newberry, wife and 3 children, Mrs. Preston, John Church, wife and 2 children, N. May, wife and child, Mrs. Charles Lamp and 5 children, Fred Oist, wife and lady visitor, Mrs. Peter Leach, Lot Leach and wife, John King, wife and 4 children, Robert King, wife and 3 children, Fred Warrenke, William Soper, William Alschweiger, Peter Keever, wife and child, Ed Cook, wife and child. Charles Hoyt, wife and child. D. Hoyt, missing. Mr. Bruce, wife and 3 children. Mrs. Chris Capoose, Mrs. Hiram Moore and 5 children. George Myers, wife and 4 children. Charles Lawrence, wife and 3 children. Mrs. William Phillips and 2 children. John Gregor and wife. Peter Shaponto. Mr. Joseph Diedrich, wife and 3 children. C.R. Trousley, wife and 3 children. Lyman Legger, wife and 2 children. John Smith, wife and 2 children. Mr. Aldris, wife and 1 child, visiting at Mays, Pratt. Wife and 2 children. John Hoyt, mother and infant brother. Hoyt Sr., wife and daughter. Mrs. Fanny Moore and 6 children. William English, Mr. Perot and 8 children. Peter Hansen, wife and 3 children. Son of John Alschweiger, died at Dunlap House. Henry Newberry Sr. 140. Peshtigo Village. J. E. Beebe, wife and 2 children. Mrs. J. J. Tanner and 2 children. James Keenan. Mrs. Charles Bruette and child. William T. Thompson and wife. Charles Plush. Mrs. Antoine Bruette. George Clement. Mrs. England and 3 children. Mrs. Solomon, James Kerr, Mrs. Lottie Seymour and sister's child. Patrick Monahan, child of J. T. Potter, son of Frank Jacobs, son and daughter of James Mellon. Daniel McGregor, wife and sister. Mrs. Donald Leroy, MacDonald and 5 children. James McGregor, wife and child of Robert Slaughter. Charles Westfall, wife and sister. Daughter of P. J. Marshall. Davis family of 7 persons. 2 sons and a daughter of John Timmer and Mrs. Silas McMinn. Roger Burton, died at Harbor. Mrs. Cornelia Tackman. 60. The loss of property on the West Shore is estimated as high as $3 million. We have devoted a large space in this book to accounts of the fire on the west shore of Green Bay. The loss of life there was greater than on the east shore, but the actual suffering, we think, was not as great. On the west shore were large settlements spared to which the survivors could flee, and daily means of communication with the city of Green Bay. On the east shore were no large places, the burned region being more a farming country, and the means of communication with the outside world were very limited. Houses, barns, cattle, horses, crops, wagons, and household goods were swept away, and the survivors of the population were turned out upon a desolate, blackened waste, without food or shelter, and no means of escape. It is one of the most remarkable things connected with this calamity that many of the survivors of the fire did not suffer death by starvation. Nothing but the most energetic action of humane people prevented it. The line of fire on the east side of Green Bay and the Fox River may be said to have commenced in the town of Morrison, Brown County, southwest from the city of Green Bay, and extended northeasterly, following nearly the line of the peninsula of Door County for a distance of 60 miles in length by from 6 to 12 miles in width. It touched the town of Wrightstown and swept through Glenmore, Rockland, De Pere, Bellevue, Preble, Eaton, Humboldt, and town of Green Bay in Brown County, through the towns of Franklin, Carlton, Casco, Pierce, Onep, Red River, and Lincoln in Kewaunee County, and through the towns of Union, Brussels, Forestville, Clay Banks, Gardner, including Williamsville, Nassawappi, Sevastopol, and part of Sturgeon Bay in Door County. The largest settlements destroyed in this track of fire were known as New Franken, Walheim, Robinsonville, Harris's Pier, Theory Dames, Dykesville, St. Sauveur, Rosier, Williamsonville, and Forestville. None of these were villages, but they were either agricultural or lumbering communities, or settlements around religious institutions. In the southern portion of the track of this fire, the principal damage was done during the month of November and the early days of October. This was also true of a portion of the rest of the district. Scarce a farm over the whole extent named had escaped the loss of fences, and hay, cordwood, railroad ties, tan bark, telegraph poles, cedar posts, etc., had been swept away, together with an occasional building. The settlement at Horn's Pier, in the town of Clay Banks, consisting of about a dozen houses, was destroyed on the night of September 23rd. On the night of October 3rd, at about the same hour of the disaster on the west shore of Green Bay, a similar tornado of fire swept over this section. It is worthy of note that the tornado here followed the same general direction of the one on the west shore, while it was distinct from it, the two being about 30 miles apart, and no noticeable gale occurring on the bay lying between. The same peculiarities of intense heat, etc., characterized both. There was no unusual apprehension of danger on that night. Most of the ground had already burned over, some of it several times, and it seemed as though the food for fire must be nearly exhausted. The only warning was the ominous roar in the woods, followed in a few moments by the surging billows of flame, before which all human skill and strength was utterly powerless. The sturdy trees of the forest were torn up by their roots, or twisted off, if they withstood the gale. Their blackened trunks attest the heat. The timber in the track of the fire was almost without exception killed. In the track of the fire on the peninsula, about 130 lives were lost, 117 of whom were in Door County. In that county, 167 families were rendered homeless, and 200 families lost a portion of their property. 2 mills, 2 boarding houses, 1 church, 6 schoolhouses, 3 stores, 2 saloons, and 148 dwelling houses were burned. 39 buildings were burned in the town of Humboldt, and 68 in Green Bay. And in the towns of Casco, Red River, and Green Bay, 1,128 persons were rendered destitute. The losses of property on this line of fire could not have been less than $2 million. The district burned over here covered an area of fully 500 square miles, and in that extent of country the desolation was almost complete. If a building escaped, it was an exception to the general rule. Chapter 15. On the Door County Peninsula, about 6 miles from Little Sturgeon Bay, the brothers Williamson had built a mill and were manufacturing shingles. They had taken there their wives and children, many of their employees had families, and there was quite a flourishing little settlement. The timber about it was dense, and the clearing not very large. The inhabitants numbered, as near as can be ascertained, 78 persons, of whom but 19 escaped to tell the tale. And of this number many were so horribly burned that death was almost preferable to life. The general phenomena of the fire, so far as we can learn from survivors, were not very different from those on the west shore. There was the same intense heat that melted the nails in kegs so that the metal run like water, and the same appearance of combustion in the air. There were 11 members of the Williamson family, all of whom perished with the exception of 2. Mrs. Williamson, mother of the young men, and Thomas Williamson, one of the sons. To the latter we are indebted for the following truthful and straightforward narrative of the fire and all the circumstances attending it. We would here remark that it is utterly impossible for any pen to portray the real horrors in such a light as to give the reader an adequate idea of them. Messrs. Tilton, Robinson, and Custerman. Gents, in accordance with your request, I give you a sketch of my experience in the destruction of our hamlet of Williamsonville. 10 days before the great fire at Williamsonville, the whole force was engaged in fighting fire. The clearing of about 10 acres was surrounded by fire from half a mile to a mile, as we thought it best to set backfires when the wind was favorable, and by so doing burned all around the clearing. Then we thought we were safe, and that the fire would not burn over the same ground a second time, but not so. That Sunday afternoon, October 8th, at about 5 o'clock, there was some fire in the potato patch. Father and brother Fred and I carried water and partly put it out. After supper, it seemed to kindle up again, so I had the teamster, John Conlin, hitch the mule team to the wagon and put the tank, which held about 9 barrels of water, on the wagon, and we took it to the mill, and John Williamson and I filled the tank with water. We took this to the potato patch and put it all on the fire except 2 barrels. One we left there, and one a few rods distant, in case the fire should start up again in the night. I then had the teamster take the tank to the creek. This time, John, James, and Fred Williamson, John Conlon, and I filled it, took it opposite the store, and left it there in case we should need it. John Conlon unhitched the mules and put them in the barn. I told him to leave the harness on that night. I then told the watchman where I wanted them to watch most, and I also went all around the clearing. There was fire in spots all around, but not so much as there was 2 days before. I then went up to Mother's house. Sister Maggie, Cousin Maggie O'Neill, and Conlon McCusker were sitting on the stoop at the door. I also sat down and talked with them. In a few minutes after that, there came a heavy puff of wind. The trees fell in all directions, and I saw the reflections of a big fire south of us. I thought it was 1.5 miles off. In less time than it takes to write this, there came another heavy gale, and the flames came rolling through the woods up to the back of the barn. I went down to the store and saw some of the men, and told them to wake up all the crew. I went to the mill, got the hose on the roof, and wet it well. Then the sparks came down like a heavy snowstorm. I wet the end and side of the mill, and all around on the ground as far as I could reach with the hose. The fire seemed to catch as fast as I could put it out. Some of the men came down to the mill, and one took the hose. The rest helped the men on the pumps. I went to the west side of the clearing. The fire caught in some sapwood. I told some of the men to put it out, but they could not. I met John Williamson, who had become much excited. He asked me what I thought of the fire. I told him not to get excited. At that time I did not think our lives were in danger. I went up to Mother's house. The fire had caught in the fence of sapwood, which was 3 tiers deep and 4 feet high, and was connected with all the houses, as the families used it for winter firewood. I told the men to make a gap in the fence and help them, but we could not get halfway to the ground. The fire drove us off, and we commenced in another place, but did not succeed there. We put water on, but it was no use. I then went to the mill. No buildings were on fire yet. I met Brother John again, and told him Mother's house would soon be on fire. He said if we could save our lives, he would be satisfied. I left him there and ran up to the boarding house, saw some of the teamsters, and told them to take the team out of the barn and shut the door. A few minutes before this, I ran over to Mother's house and told the women to put on men's pantaloons, as I thought they would be safer than their own clothing. Mother put on woolen underclothes and a woolen dress. Mrs. James Williamson did so too, but Maggie Williamson and Maggie O'Neill did not. As I came to the boarding house, as last stated, all the women were there. Joseph Married was on the roof spreading wet blankets. Frank McAdams, a blacksmith, came out of the potato field, went into the boarding house, and came out bringing one child on his arm and leading another, and his wife followed with a babe in her arms. All the rest of the women and children followed him into the potato patch. Just before they left, I told them to take wet blankets, and some did so. I had one, but gave it to my sister and told her to wrap it well around her. She followed the rest. I did not think there was any danger in the potato patch. I saw Father carrying things from Mother's house, and told him if he could save his life, it would be all he could do. He had on slippers, and went back after his boots, but came back with only one. At this time, all the houses in the mill were in flames. I could not see anybody but Thomas Cryan. He was standing by the well at the door of the boarding house. I picked up a blanket and started for the potato patch, and Cryan said to me, "Here is a good place to go down in the well." I paid no attention to him, as my sister had left a few minutes before, and I intended to catch her. I tramped through the fire, as there was fire almost all over the potato patch, and the smoke was so thick I could not see more than a rod ahead. Thomas Bush rode a pony into the potato field, and in less than 5 minutes I saw him on foot, the pony having become unmanageable. I came up to where there were 35 persons all huddled together, sitting on the ground. The smoke was so thick I could not tell who they were. Some were crying, and some praying. I went about 2 rods from them, and there were 6 or 7 men walking back and forth in the fire. I do not know who they were, as I was so excited I thought of no one but myself. I walked back and forth a few times, and then a thought came to my mind to run. I ran about 5 rods from there through the fire, and here I saw a spot of about a rod square where there had been a log heap burned in the spring in clearing this land off. I lay down there on my face. The smoke was so thick that I thought I could not live. I rolled on my back and side and rooted with my face in the ground for air. Every time the wind blew, I thought was my last. The trees fell around me every minute, and I thought they would fall on me. One top fell within 10 feet of me. My feet were burning, and my vest caught fire. I could feel the fire burning my back. Twice I put my hand on my back and tried to wring the cloth of my vest to put the fire out. Then I thought I would roll into a big blaze and die quick. Still I lay there. I think I became unconscious. About 3 or 4 o'clock the smoke cleared away, and I thought I was the only one left to tell the tale. I would have given all I ever had for water. I cannot tell you how I suffered for it. I tried to get up, but could not. I lay some time longer, and finally got upon my feet. I was so weak I could not stand, and lay down again. I then heard someone halloo, and I did so too, but I could not tell where the sound came from. I lay there some time, and then got on my feet and called again. This time there came an old man by the name of Cap Richmond. I asked him to get me some water, and he went away but did not come back. I could not walk. I lay there some time and then got up, feeling a little better. I walked along in the direction the noise came from when I heard the first call. I staggered like a drunken man. I was so weak and was almost blind. I could see nothing left to tell where I was, as every building was gone. I hallooed again and was answered by someone about 2 rods ahead of me. I went over there and asked for water. They had some that Tom Bush had taken from the well where Thomas Cryan and a little French child lay dead. They told me this, but I did not care. I was suffering so. I drank about a quart, but it did not taste like water. Thomas Bush, Connell McCusker, James Donlin, and Mother were there. They were all lying down, and some had blankets over them. It became very cold in the morning. I could see dead bodies close by, some not 6 feet off. I trembled with the cold. Mother asked me if I saw any of the family, and I told her no. We lay there until daylight and then got up. The bodies lay in all directions. There were 35 or so in one heap. I could not recognize any of them, as they were so badly burnt. I got Cyril Jarvis to halloo, as though there might be some survivors in the woods. He did so, and someone answered. I thought it was John Williamson's voice. I asked if that was John Williamson, and the person answered no. I then wandered over the potato patch, seeing bodies here and there, and at length found one that I recognized as that of John. He looked natural. Both his shirts were burned off, but his pantaloons were not burned. I went from there to Mother. She wanted me to take her away to Little or Big Sturgeon Bay, or to some house. The nearest house was 3.5 miles, and the road was so filled with trees that we lost the way a number of times. It was a tedious tramp. Before we reached the location of the first house, Mr. Murray's, we suffered fearfully for water. At length we came in sight of the clearing, and found that all the buildings were burned. There was a little muddy water at the side of the road, and we drank some. Mother drank till I had to pull her away. The next house was Mr. Langley's, 1/2 mile away, and we thought if we could reach there, we would get him to take us with his team to Sturgeon Bay. But we found that house and all the buildings burned also. We saw 2 of his horses and took them, as Mother could go no further on foot. I led her horse by the halter. B.J. Merrill rode the other the same, as he could not help himself to drive. The next building had been a mill, and that and still the next house were burned. The next house was that of Mr. Daly, which we found still standing. It had taken us from daylight until 3:30 p.m. to come here, 6 miles. We found 6 families in this house, but they did all they could for us, and we remained there until next day, when we were taken down to Sturgeon Bay. But I must return to my narrative of the fire at Williamsonville. James Collins, one of the teamsters, took his team out of the barn and led them to the potato patch. He had to let one go, and shortly after the fire and smoke were so bad, he had to let the other, the favorite one, go. 3 times she followed him, and put her head on his shoulder, and he finally had to take a stick to drive her off, as he was afraid she would trample on him. When I left the girls on the stoop, they went into the house and were going to bed. Mother saw the fire through the window. Then she went to the door and saw the fire rolling over the tops of the trees. She called the girls to the door and said that this was more than common, and they began to cry. Just then, Fred Williamson came up to the house and told them not to cry, that it would not be as bad as they expected. Mother said, "Oh, Fred, go and wake the McAdams family up, or they will be burned alive." He did this, and that was the last Mother ever saw of Fred. The McAdams family consisted of 5. They soon dressed and came to Mother's house, as their house and George Buckland's and Michael Whalen's house were all on fire. Buckland's family consisted of 3, and Whalen's of 4. Mother took what clothes she needed, and the girls did the same, and they left their lamps burning, as the house was already on fire. From there they went to the boarding house, and all the women in the clearing went there for safety. They were all crying and praying. McAdams came into the boarding house and took his wife and children, as I have stated before, and the women all followed her. Mother saw John Williamson and asked him what she should do. He said, "Mother, help yourself. I give up," moving his hands up and down in a very excited manner. That was the last that Mother ever saw of him. Then she crossed the fence of sapwood into the potato patch. It was so hot there she recrossed. Then the heat from the burning boarding house was so great that she crossed the fence again to the potato patch. All the women and some of the men did the same. They all went to the middle of the potato patch, and Mother sat down beside a woman. She did not sit there long before she heard the woman scream out, "Nelson, I am on fire." Then Mother left there and leaned over a stump nearby. She saw that the stump was on fire, and stepped 3 or 4 yards from there, where 2 little stones were sticking up out of the ground a few inches apart. She got her feet in between them, wrapped a wet blanket she had brought from the boarding house tight around her, and stooped down with her chin resting on her knees. In this position she was saved. Someone passed by her, and putting a hand on her head, uttered a loud cry, and came near pushing her over. A few minutes later the fire appeared to get hotter, and parting the blanket she looked out, and saw a woman lying beside her all on fire. She could see the earrings in her ears. She was dead, and the blaze from the body blew directly to her. She put her hand down inside the blanket and tried to move away the head of the corpse, but could not. She could hear the flesh snap. The blaze came from the body and singed the blanket on Mother's shoulder that was next the body. Her feet got on fire, and she put her hand down inside the blanket, picked up dirt and put out the fire, and in doing so burned her fingers. Mother was not more than 10 feet from where 35 persons perished. She remained in this position about 5 hours. Conalyn McCusker was the first that came to her in the morning at about 5 o'clock. The fire and smoke had cleared away somewhat, and he took her from there to another place. She was not able to rise up from sitting in that position. He took her where I found her, as I stated before. It has been reported in the papers that Thomas Cryan, our barn boss, saved her by putting water on her through the night. That statement is not true. She has also been reported as 80 years old and blind. Both incorrect. She is 53 years old. Conalyn McCusker saw Louis Langlois and Frank Bowden, of Bay Settlement, run and strike their heads against a stump, trying to kill themselves rather than be burned to death. One boy by the name of James Donlin, a shingle packer, was heard to say, "What will my poor mother say when she hears of this in Scotland?" Thomas Whalen, a boy 14 years old, went into a bake oven. The logs that the oven was built on burned out, and it caved in on him, and he was lost. 7 persons went into a well. Byron J. Merrill was the last that went in. When he came to the well, the curb was on fire, and he tore it off and spread his blanket over the top of the well. If he had not done this, all in the well would have been lost. As it was, 2 in the well died, Thomas Cryan and Maxime Cania's little child. The names of those who escaped alive from the well are B.J. Merrill, Louis Ligui of Oshkosh, Joseph Cryan, Cyril Jarvis, and Maxime Cania of Green Bay. There were about 59 lost in all, and 17 escaped. There was 1 horse escaped out of 17, and 1 ox out of 6. 38 hogs were lost, 1 large barn, store boarding house, mill, blacksmith shop, and 8 dwelling houses. There were 9 of my folks burned to death. Father, John Williamson, wife and babe, James Williamson and wife, Miss Maggie Williamson, my cousin Miss Maggie O'Neill, and Freddie Williamson. The following are the names of some of the lost: Frank McAdams, wife and 3 children, George Buckland, wife and babe, Michael Whalen, wife and 2 little boys, Nelson Demereux, wife and 2 children, Maxime Kania lost wife and child, Joseph married, wife and 3 children, Miss Maggie Heaney, Charles Danson, James Donlin, John Conlon, Louis Langlois, Patrick O'Hearn, Johnny O'Hearn, Jason Williams, Henry Jervis, Emery Jervis, Dennis Nicholson, John O'Connor, Charles Whitbeck, Michael Roken, Peter Bowdwin, Frank Bowdwin, Frank Donnelly, Joseph Verbunker. There were also 2 French families whose names I do not know. Thomas Williamson. End of chapters 14 and 15. Conclusion of Sketch of the Great Fires in Wisconsin by Frank Tilton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Verla Viera. Conclusion. We have in the preceding pages attempted to delineate the horrors of this awful calamity. It is a sad story, all of it, with scarce a pleasing feature, but we design now to put a silver lining on the dark cloud. This is a great, a noble, and a generous people, and no emergency has ever arisen calling for the exercise of liberality, but that the response has been prompt and effective. Immediately upon the receipt of the news of the calamity, a meeting was held in Green Bay, and a committee of relief organized. Similar committees were organized at Marinette, Menominee, and Oconto, and these committees immediately began the work of relieving the immediate pressing necessities of the survivors in furnishing food, shelter, clothing, medicine, physicians, and nurses. But as additional returns came in, it was discovered that the extent of the disaster was too great for relief by local aid, and the governor of Wisconsin, Honorable Lucius Fairchild, was telegraphed to, who in turn published a touching appeal for aid to the people of the state and country generally. The attention of the whole nation, and in fact of Europe, was at that moment taken up with the startling news of the destruction of the best portion of Chicago, and the fact that her citizens were homeless and without food. But the appeal of the governor opened their eyes to the fact that, sad as was the case of Chicago, that of northern Wisconsin was infinitely worse. A suggestion of need would have been sufficient. Food and clothing began to pour into Green Bay, first by the carload and then by the trainload. There came cooked provisions and bread, apparently enough to feed all the people of the state, until we were obliged to cry, "Enough!" There came scores and hundreds of boxes of clothing for persons of all ages, boots and shoes, and every imaginable article of necessity. Some were new, some a little worn, and some nearly worthless. Almost every consignment came with a message that more and better were being prepared. They came from every state, from the Atlantic to the Rocky Mountains, and California, eager to help, telegraphed her checks for money. Touching indeed were some of the messages accompanying the goods. The careful housewife, as she packed up what clothing her own flock could spare, did not, in her haste, forget to put in pieces to mend dilapidated articles, and even thread, needles, and buttons were found in the pockets. The bereaved mother sent the clothing of the dead child that had been carefully laid away as a memento. The thoughtful grandma, as she sent the stockings knit by her own hands, penned to them a paper invoking God's blessing on the gift. Gentlemen's clothing came, with articles and sometimes money in the pockets, that the hasty giver had forgotten to take out. This great influx of goods was promptly met here. 2 large stores were secured, and many of the ladies of Green Bay devoted their entire time for weeks to the work of assorting and repacking, and all without money and without price. Wagons, teams, men, and steamboats were brought into requisition to take the articles to the sufferers. And the work at Green Bay was only different from that in other places because of its magnitude. There was a relief committee in almost every city and village, or wherever there was a cluster of a dozen farmhouses in Wisconsin. It soon became apparent that one central relief depot was not sufficient, and another was organized at Milwaukee, and the burned region was partitioned off, that portion consisting of Manitowoc County, the towns of Kewaunee, Onapee, Montpelier, Pierce, and Lincoln. In Kewaunee County, Forestville, Claybanks, and Sturgeon Bay in Door County, and Menominee, Michigan, were embraced in the district to be supplied from Milwaukee, and all the remainder of the burned district from Green Bay. The Milwaukee district contained 377 destitute families, consisting of 1,509 persons, or at least that was the number of persons who had received help up to February 1st. In the Green Bay district, the number relieved were 1,157 families, consisting of 5,678 persons. The aggregate, then, of those persons in Wisconsin who suffered sufficiently to require aid was 1,534 families of 7,187 persons. The character and amount of the aid required may readily be imagined by the nature of the loss. The immediate necessity was for clothing, food, medicines, and shelter. These supplied, and the next requirements were lumber for temporary buildings, nails and glass, tools, and fodder for cattle. These wants were mostly met by the generosity of the public, and by the middle of winter the sufferers were rendered tolerably comfortable. The nature of the losses may be described in a few words. Besides the losses of life, of human beings and animals, in that portion of the district where the fire was most severe, houses, barns, and fences were all swept away, together with the crops, and the grass roots were burned out, the timber entirely destroyed, and not a vestige of anything left upon which men or animals could subsist. So utter was the destruction, that the earth must remain for years a barren desert waste, unless seeded anew with grass. Much of the richest soil was alluvial deposit, and this, particularly in swampy places, was destroyed, the earth burning in some instances to the depth of 2 or 3 feet, leaving nothing but sand and ashes where the best land had been. Under these circumstances, it will be seen that the aid extended will have to be continued during an entire year from the date of the calamity, or until another harvest is secured. In the spring and summer, seeds, agricultural implements, cattle, horses, and wagons must be provided, in order to put the people who go back upon their farms, as most of the survivors have, in a condition to help themselves. Then the bridges and culverts on the roads must be rebuilt, and it is plain that in a town in which every surviving inhabitant lost every dollar he possessed, it is impossible for the town to do this work unaided. Money contributions from the whole-souled, generous-hearted people of most sections of the United States, and even from Great Britain, Germany, and other portions of Europe, have flowed in without stint, showing that in these enlightened days all civilized nations and people are kindred in times of suffering. It is, we find, impossible for us to give a complete statement of cash contributions received. The receipts at Green Bay from October 8th to January 15th were $91,085.98, and at Milwaukee, up to February 5th, $144,000. There were also large sums received by the Governor of Wisconsin, Honorable Lucius Fairchild, the amount of which we cannot state, and sums were received at Marinette, Menominee, Oconto, and possibly other points. We estimate the total cash receipts up to March 1st at $350,000. Captain A.J. Langworthy, General Agent for the Burned District, hands us the following statement of cash receipts and expenditures of the Milwaukee Relief Committee up to February 5, 1872. Paid for supplies shipped to Green Bay and Marinette, $24,017.39. Paid for supplies shipped to West Shore of Lake Michigan, Wisconsin, $26,391.79. Paid for supplies shipped to Menominee, Michigan, $3,766.55. Paid for relief of Chicago and other sufferers by fire, refugees in Milwaukee, $9,038.80. Paid for supplies shipped to Chicago soon after the fire, $4,992.25. Paid for freight, cartage, labor, rent, and insurance on supplies, $5,495.47. Paid for agent salaries and office expenses, Executive Committee, $1,676.28. Total contributions, $75,378.53. Balance in hands of Treasurer, $68,621.47. Total disbursements, $144,000. William J. Langson, Secretary. The value of the supplies received at Milwaukee is estimated at $85,000 and of clothing at $60,000. The United States government contributed 4,000 heavy woolen Army blankets, 1,500 Army trousers, 1,500 Army overcoats, and 100 Army wagons and sets of harness, and as a grand final gift, sent on 200,000 rations of hard bread, beans, bacon, dried beef, pork, sugar, rice, tea, coffee, etc. The Central Committee of Relief at Green Bay, as at present organized, March 1, 1872, consists of Executive Committee, Captain W. R. Bourne, Chairman, M. T. Bailey and H. N. Moulton, Finance Committee, Colonel Charles D. Robinson, W. C. E. Thomas, Treasurer, Honorable Alonzo Kimball. There are subcommittees in the various towns in the burned districts, for example at Marinette, at the head of which is Dr. J. J. Sherman, and a distributing depot at Peshtigo in charge of F. J. Bartels. The Relief Committee at Milwaukee consists of Honorable Harrison Luddington, Honorable Alexander Mitchell, John Plankinton, George W. Allen, Angus Smith, Guido Feister, John Dahlman, Charles F. Ilsley, Fred Layton, Edward Sanderson, William P. McLaren, William Young, John Nasro, L. H. Kellogg, James Bonnell, John Johnston, J. C. Smith, Julius Gall, John Black, and C. H. Larkin. Executive Committee, M. P. Garrett, Chairman, A. J. Langworthy, J. A. Dutcher, C. J. Kershaw, A. J. Langworthy, General Agent. After the fire, hospitals were established at various points, among which were Green Bay and Marinette, where large numbers of sick and maimed were treated. The Green Bay Hospital is long since discontinued. At Marinette, Dr. B. T. Phillips, surgeon in charge, still, March 1st, has about 40 cases in hand. The patients were generally suffering from burns, the inhaling of hot air, smoke, and noxious gases, or from fevers. Thanks to the skill of the physicians and the tender care of ladies who volunteered as nurses, the deaths were comparatively few. Honorable mention should here be made of the resident physicians who rendered prompt and valuable aid, both at Green Bay and Marinette, and of those who came from abroad and tendered their services. We cannot close this book without a tribute of thanks to the generosity of the various railroad, express, and telegraph companies who gave the use of their lines and their rolling stock at a season of the year when they were in most demand for legitimate business, freely and without pay, in the work of relieving the destitute and transporting the refugees who left the scene of disaster. Prominent among these was the Chicago and Northwestern Railway Company, whose generosity will ever be gratefully remembered. The proprietors and officers of the various steamboat lines on Green Bay are also entitled to thanks for similar favors. End of conclusion. End of Sketch of the Great Fires in Wisconsin by Frank Tilton.